Chapter 20 of Love Romances of the Aristocracy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Love Romances of the Aristocracy by Thornton Hall. Chapter 20, A Peasant Countess. In the dusk of a July evening in the year 1791, a dust-covered, footsore traveller entered the pretty little Shropshire village of Bolas Magna, which nestles in its setting of green fields and orchards, almost in the shadow of the Wrekin. The traveller had tramped many a long league under a burning sun, and was too weary to fare farther. Moreover, night was closing in fast, and a few hissing raindrops and the distant rumble of thunder warned him that a storm was about to break. He must find some sort of shelter for the night, and among the few thatch-covered cottages in whose windows lights were beginning to twinkle, his steps led him to a modest farmhouse behind the small village church. In answer to his knock, the door was opened by a burly, pleasant-faced farmer, of whom the stranger craved a refuge from the storm until the morning, and a little food, for which he offered to pay handsomely. "I shall be grateful for even a chair to sit on," added the weary traveller, when the farmer protested that he had no accommodation to offer him. "Very well," said the farmer, relenting. "Come in, and we'll do the best we can for you. It's going to be a bad night, not fit to turn a dog out in, much less a gentleman, and I can see you're that." And a few minutes later the grateful stranger was seated in Farmer Hoggins's cozy kitchen before a steaming plate of stew, while the thunder crashed overhead and the rain dashed in a deluge against the window panes. Thus dramatically opened one of the most romantic chapters in the story of the British peerage. As Farmer Hoggins shrewdly concluded, his travel-stained guest was at least a gentleman. His voice and bearing proclaimed that fact, but the farmer little suspected the true rank of the man he was thus entertaining unawares, or all that was to come from his good-hearted hospitality to a stranger who was so affable and so entertaining. Although he was known in his own world as plain Mr. Henry Cecil, he was a man of ancient lineage, and closely allied to some of the greatest in the land. Long centuries earlier, when William Rufus was king, one of his ancestors had done doughty deeds in the conquest of Glamorganshire, and from that distant day all his forefathers had been men who had held their heads among the highest. One of them was none other than the famous Lord Burleigh, one of England's greatest statesmen, favourite minister and friend of Henry VIII and his two queen daughters. So great was my Lord Burleigh's wealth that, as Sir Bernard Burke tells us, he had 4 places of residence: his lodgings at court, his house in the Strand, his family seat at Burleigh, and his own favourite seat of Theobald's, near Waltham Cross, to which he loved to retire from harness. At his house in London he supported a family of 80 persons, without counting those who attended him in public. He kept a standing table for gentlemen, and 2 other tables for those of a meaner condition, and these were always served alike, whether he was in or out of town. 12 times he entertained Elizabeth at his house, on more than one occasion for some weeks together, and as royal visits are rather expensive luxuries, and Elizabeth's formed no exception to the rule, for they cost between £1,000 and £2,000, the only wonder is that his purse was not exhausted, and that he was able to leave his son £25,000 in money and valuable effects, besides £4,000 a year in landed estates. Such was the splendour of this early Cecil, whose 2 sons were both raised to earldoms of Exeter and Salisbury on the same day. Henry himself was heir to one of these family earldoms, that of Exeter, and some day would wear a coronet and be lord of vast estates, although the knowledge gave him little pleasure. His parents had died in his boyhood, and as his uncle, the Earl, took no interest in his heir, the lad was left to his own devices. In good time he had wooed and married the pretty daughter of a West of England squire, a Miss Vernon, who proved as wayward as she was winsome. His wedded life was indeed so far from being a bed of roses that he was thankful to recover his liberty by divorcing his wife, and at the age of 37, but a few months before this story opens, he was a free man once more. Courts and coronets had no attractions for him. His marriage had proved a bitter draught. He was a disappointed and disillusioned man, and he determined that if ever he took another wife, she should be a plain, homely, and truly virtuous maiden in whatever sphere of life I find her. Then I swear with King Cophetua, this beggar maid shall be my queen. Full of this romantic, if quixotic resolve, Henry Cecil strapped a knapsack on his back, and staff in hand tramped off in search of the beggar maid who was to bring him happiness at last, or if he could not discover her, at least to find some place of retirement where he could lead a simple life, remote from the empty splendors and vanities of the world to which he was born, and in which he had sought happiness in vain. And thus it was that in his wanderings his steps led him to the little village in Shropshire, and to the hospitable roof of Farmer Hoggins and his good wife, whose hearts he had won before the humble supper table was cleared on that stormy July night. No doubt the stranger's enjoyment of the farmer's hospitality was enhanced by the glimpses he had caught of his host's daughter, Sarah, a rustic beauty of 17 summers, with a complexion of cream and roses, with a wealth of brown hair and lovely blue eyes, which from time to time glanced shyly at the good-looking stranger. No doubt, too, it was the wish to see more of pretty Miss Sarah that was responsible for the stranger's reluctance to resume his journey on the following morning, which dawned bright and beautiful. So far from showing any anxiety to continue his tramping, Cecil begged his hosts and hostesses permission to spend a few days with them. He was, he said, a painter by profession. It would give him the greatest pleasure to spend a few days sketching in such a beautiful district, and he would pay well for the hospitality. The farmer and his wife, who had already grown attached to their pleasant guest, were by no means unwilling to accept the offer, nor did they raise any protest when the days grew into weeks and months. These were halcyon days for the world-weary man, delightful days of sketching in the open air, in an environment of natural beauty, peaceful evenings spent with his simple-minded hosts and friends, and happiest of all, the hours in which he basked in the smiles and blushes of pretty Sarah Hoggins, carrying home her pails of milk, helping her to churn the butter, or telling to her wondering ears stories of the great world outside her ken, while the sunset steeped the orchard trees above their heads in glory. To Sarah he was known as Mr. Jones, and to her innocent mind it never occurred that he could be other than the painter he professed to be. The villagers, however, were skeptical. True, the stranger was a pleasant man who always gave them a cheery good day, and gossiped with them in the friendliest manner, but that there was some mystery connected with him all agreed. Painter chaps were notoriously poor, and this man always seemed to have plenty of money to fling about. Then he would disappear periodically, and always returned with more money. Where did he go, and how did he get his gold? There could be little doubt about it. This handsome, mysterious, pleasant-tongued stranger must be a highwayman, for it was a fact that every time he was absent a coach or a chaise was held up in the neighborhood and its occupants relieved of their valuables. Suspicion became certainty when Mr. Jones bought a piece of land in their village and began to build the finest house in the whole district, a house which must cost, in their bucolic view, a mint of money. But Mr. Jones simply smiled at their suspicions and made himself more agreeable than ever. He loved the farmer's daughter, and she made no concealment of her love for him, and nothing else mattered. He had won his beggar maid, and happiness was at last within his grasp. When he asked his hosts for the hand of their daughter in marriage, the good lady was indignant. "Marry Sarah!" she exclaimed. "What, to a fine gentleman? No, indeed, no happiness can come from such a marriage." But the farmer for once put his foot down. "Yes," he said, "he shall marry her. The lass loves him dearly, and has he not house and land too, and plenty of money to keep her?" And thus it came to pass that one October day the church bells of Follis rang a merry peal. The villagers put on their gala clothes, and amid general rejoicing, qualified by not a few dark hints and forebodings, Sarah Hoggins was led to the rustic altar by her highwayman bridegroom. For 2 ideally happy years Mr. Jones lived with his humble bride in the fine new house which he had built for her, and which he called Burleigh Villa. He had lived down his character of highwayman, and was regarded and respected as the most important man in the village. He was even appointed to the honourable offices of churchwarden and overseer, while under his tuition his peasant wife was becoming, in the words of the village gossips, quite the lady. One day towards the end of December 1793, after 2 years of this idyllic life, Mr. Jones chanced to read in a country paper news which he had dreaded, for it meant a revolution in his life, the return to the world he had so gladly forsaken. His dream of the simple life of peaceful days was at an end. His uncle, the old earl, was dead, and the coronet and large estates had devolved on him. Should he refuse to take them and end his days in this idyllic obscurity, or should he claim the baubles and return to the hollow splendor of a life on which he had turned his back? The struggle between duty and inclination was long and bitter, but in the end duty carried the day. He would go to Burleigh House by Stamford Town and fill his place on the roll of the Earls of Exeter. To his wife he merely said, "To-morrow we must start on a journey to Lincolnshire. Business calls me there, and we will go together." A proposal to which she gladly consented, for it meant that she would see something of the great outside world with the husband she loved. At daybreak next morning Mr. Jones said good-bye to his kind hosts and relatives, and to the scene of so much peaceful happiness, and mounting his wife behind him on a pillion, started on the journey to distant Lincolnshire. Through Cannock Chase, by Lichfield and Leicester they rode, finding hospitality at many a great house on the way, rather to the dismay of Sarah, who would have preferred the accommodation of some modest inn, and who marvelled not a little that her husband, the obscure artist, should be known to and welcomed by such great folk. But was he not her hero, one of nature's gentlemen, and as such the equal of any man in the land? At last, after days of happy journeying through the cold December days, they came within view of a stately mansion placed in a lordly park, at sight of which Sarah exclaimed with sparkling eyes, "Oh, what a beautiful house!" "Yes," answered her husband, reining in his horse to enjoy the view, "it is a lovely place. How would you like, my dear Sally, to be its mistress?" Sally broke into a merry peal of laughter. "Only fancy me," she said, "mistress of such a noble house. It's too funny for words. But how I should love it if we were only rich enough to live in it." "I am so glad you like it, darling," answered her husband, as he turned in the saddle and placed an arm around her waist, "for it is yours. I am the Earl of Exeter, its owner, and you, well, you are my Countess, and my Queen." "Now welcome, lady," exclaimed the Earl, "this castle is thine, and these dark woods all." She believed him wild, but his words were truth, for Ellen is Lady of Rosenthal. He did not, like the hero of Moore's ballad, blow his horn with a lordly air, but with his Countess he presented himself at the door of Burleigh to receive the homage and welcome due to its lord. Many a gallant gay domestic bow before him at the door, and they speak in gentle murmur when they answer to his call, while he treads with footsteps firmer, leading on from hall to hall. And while now she wanders blindly, nor the meaning can divine, proudly turns he round and kindly, all of that is mine and thine. Thus did Sarah Hoggins, the peasant girl, blossom into a countess, chatelaine of 3 lordly pleasure houses, and Lady Bountiful to an army of dependents. The news of the romantic story flashed through the county, indeed through the whole of England, and great lords and ladies by the score flocked to Burleigh to welcome and pay homage to its heroine. For a few, 2 brief years, Countess Sarah was happy in her new and splendid environment, though it is said she often sighed for the dear dead days when her husband was a landscape painter and she his humble bride in their village home. The modest Primrose did not bear well the transplanting to the lordly hothouse. Her cheeks began to lose their roses. She bore to her husband 3 children, and then, like a lily drooping, she bowed down her head and died, tenderly and lovingly nursed to the last breath by the husband whose heart, it is said, died with her. Of her 2 sons, the elder succeeded to his father's earldom and was promoted to a marquisate. The younger, Lord Thomas Cecil, married a daughter of the 4th Duke of Richmond, thus mingling the peasant blood of Hoggins with the royal strain of the merry monarch, and survived until the year 1873. Her daughter had for husband the Right Honourable Henry Manvers Pierpont, and became grandmother to the present Duke of Wellington, who thus has for great-grandmother Sarah Hoggins, the rustic beauty, who milked cows and was wooed in the Shropshire orchard by Mr. Jones the highwayman when George the Third was king. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Love Romances of the Aristocracy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Love Romances of the Aristocracy by Thornton Hall. Chapter 21, The Favourite of a Queen. When Robert Dudley was cradled in the year 1532, the ball of fortune was already at his feet, awaiting the necessary vigour and enterprise to kick it. He had, it is true, no great lineage to boast of. Cecil spoke contemptuously of him in later and envious years as grandson of a mere squire and son of a knight. But the so-called squire was none other than Edmund Dudley, the shrewd financier and crafty-tongued minion of Henry VII, who, with Empson for ally, filled his sovereign's purse with ill-gotten gold, and paid for his enterprise with his head, when the 8th Henry set himself to the paying off of old scores. His father, the knight, was that John Dudley, King Henry's trusted friend and executor of his will, Admiral and Earl Marshal of England, whose splendid gifts and boundless ambition won a dukedom for him and made him for a time more powerful than his king. Such was the parentage of Robert Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland's 5th son, who inherited with his grandfather's scheming brain and plausible tongue the ambition and love of splendour which made his father the most brilliant subject of 2 kings. And this great, if dangerous, heritage was not long in manifesting itself in the young lordling, who was destined to add to his family's story a chapter more romantic and dazzling than that of which his father was the hero. As a boy in the schoolroom, he was quick to show gifts of mind almost phenomenal in one so young. Latin and Italian, mathematics, and abstruse sciences came as easily to this scion of the Dudleys as reading and arithmetic to less dowered boys. And with this precocity of mind he developed physical graces and skill no less remarkable, until by the time he was well in his teens, few grown men could ride a horse, couch a lance, or speed an arrow with such skill as he. At the royal court, where his ducal father was autocrat, the handsome boy of all the accomplishments found immediate favor and rapid promotion. He was dubbed a knight when most youths of his years were still wrestling with their Latin grammar. He was appointed for life master of the Buckhounds, and was chosen one of the 6 gilded youths who ministered to the king in the privy chamber. And in love he was as precocious as at the royal court, and in mental and manly accomplishments, for at 18 we find him standing at the altar in the king's palace at Sheen, near Richmond, with his youthful sovereign as best man. Whether it was really a love match or not is open to doubt. Perhaps, for Robert Dudley seems to have had little voice in the choice of his bride. For his elder brother Guilford, the Duke chose a wife of exalted rank, none other than the Lady Jane Grey, granddaughter of Louis XII's queen and Henry VIII's sister. But for his boy Robert, a plain knight's daughter seems to have been good enough in his eyes, and she was Amy, child of Sir John Robsart of Ciderstern, a lady whose fate was to be as full of pathos and tragedy as that of his brother Guilford's wife. For a time, however, fortune seemed to smile on this union of the Duke's son and the knight's daughter, who was as fair as she was to be unfortunate, and who was not without a goodly dower of Norfolk lands on which her youthful husband settled for a few years of peaceful life. He soon became a man of mark in the county of his adoption, taking the lead in local affairs, administering his estates with skill, and finally blossoming into a member of Parliament to represent his neighbours at Westminster. But the call of court life was always in his ears, and many a long spell he stole from his wife and his rural duties to spend among the gaieties of Whitehall or the splendours of Henry II's French entourage. With the death of the boy king, Edward VI, a change tragic and unexpected came in the young knight's life. His ambitious father coveted a crown for his daughter-in-law, the Lady Jane Grey, whom he had induced Edward on his deathbed to nominate as his successor, and Northumberland, thus armed with royal authority and spurred by his insatiable ambition, sought by force of arms to give effect to his scheme almost before the breath had left the late sovereign's body. How his daring project failed is well-known history. How the Princess Mary, on her way southward to her throne, eluded Robert Dudley, who was sent to intercept her. How she equally outwitted Northumberland and his army, and made her triumphant entry into London as queen. And how her vengeance fell on those who had sought to snatch the crown from her. From the Duke and Lady Jane to Robert Dudley, all the traitors who had conspired to do this dastardly deed were sent to cool their misguided ardour in the Tower, from which Northumberland, Jane, and her husband were led to the headsman's block, while Robert Dudley was among those who were left to languish in durance, and to while away the tedious hours of captivity by carving their emblems and names on the walls of their cells, where they may be seen to this day, or to stroll disconsolately on the Tower leads by way of melancholy exercise. Robert, it is said, found many of these hours of duress far from unpleasant, for among the prisoners in the Tower was none other than the Princess Elizabeth, sister to the Queen, and her successor on the throne. And we are told, on what authority does not appear, that there were many sweet and stolen meetings between the fair young princess and the captive knight, when bribed warders turned a blind eye on their dallying. And rumour even goes so far as to speak of secret nuptials, the fruits of which were in late years to bear such high names as my Lord of Essex and Francis Bacon. Fairy tales, no doubt, but stripped of such ornamental embellishment, there can be little doubt that it was within the Tower's grim walls that Dudley first learnt to love the lady who was to be his queen, and in whose life he was destined to play such a romantic part, when she should wear her crown, and he should be her avowed lover and aspirant to her hand. A year of such pleasantly qualified captivity, and Robert Dudley was a free man again, sent to purge his treason by a queen indulgent to his youth, and it may be to his good looks. by wielding a sword in the war then raging between Spain and France. And here he acquitted himself so valiantly for Mary's Spanish allies that on his return in 1558, covered with glory, the ban on the Dudleys was removed, and Robert and his brothers and sisters were restored to all the rank and rights their father's treason had forfeited. A few months later, Queen Mary died, and when Elizabeth ascended the throne, Dudley's son burst into splendor. The romance, which had been cradled amidst the fearful joys of prison meetings, was now to flourish under vastly changed conditions. That the new queen had lost her heart to the handsome and accomplished cavalier, whose prowess in war had set the seal on the favor won by his graces of person and mind and his ingratiating charm, there can be small doubt. And as little that Dudley, forgetful of the wife left to pine in solitude in her Norfolk home, returned the devotion of the lady, now his sovereign, who had made his Tower prison a palace of delight. Nor did Elizabeth make any concealment of her passion. She was a queen, and none should question her right to smile on any man, be he subject or king. Before she had been a year on the throne, Dudley was proudly wearing the coveted garter, was a privy councillor, and master of her Majesty's horse. She gave him fat lands and monasteries to add to the large possessions with which her brother Edward had endowed his favourite. And wherever she went on her royal progresses, Robert Dudley rode gallantly at her right hand, a king in all but name, and no queen ever had more splendid escort. He was indeed a man after her own heart, the beau ideal of a cavalier, a lover like herself of pomp and splendor, a past master of the arts of pageantry and pleasure, and the owner of a tongue as skilled in the language of adroit flattery as in the use of honeyed words. Such was Robert Dudley, who loved his queen, and such the queen who returned undisguised admiration for flattery and love for love. That the greatest kings and princes of Europe sought the young queen's hand, that ambassadors tumbled over each other in their eagerness to press on her this splendid alliance, and that mattered nothing to her. Her hand was her own as much as her crown. She would dispose of it as she wished, and none should say her nay. To the fears and anger of her people at the prospect of her alliance with a subject, she was as indifferent as to the jealousies of Dudley's court rivals. She could afford to smile at them all, and she did. And while Dudley was thus basking in the smiles of his sovereign, the Lady Amy was eating her heart out in loneliness and a futile jealousy in Norfolk. Her husband, it is true, paid her a duty visit now and then, and kept her purse well supplied for dresses she had not the heart to wear. She knew she had lost his love, if indeed she had ever had it, and she spent her days, as was known too late, in tears and prayers for deliverance from a burden she was too weary to bear longer. One day in September 1560, an ominous rumor began to take voice. Dudley's wife had been poisoned by her husband, it was said, with bated breath. The Queen herself heard and repeated the report to the Spanish ambassador, varying it on the following day by the statement that Lord Robert's wife had broken her neck. It appears that she fell down a staircase, and this amended version proved to be tragically true. While Dudley was dallying with his queen amid the splendors of the court, his devoted wife was found with her neck broken, lying at the foot of a staircase in the house of a Norfolk neighbor whose guest she was. How had this tragedy happened, and had Dudley any hand in it, were the questions that passed fearfully from mouth to mouth, from end to end of England. The story, as told at the inquest, throws little light on what must always remain more or less a mystery. This story was as simple as it was tragic. It seems that Amy Robsart, for by her maiden name she will always live in memory and in pity, rose early on Sunday morning, the 8th of September, the day of her death, and suggested that the entire household at Cumnor Place, at which she was staying, should leave her alone and spend the day at a neighbouring fair at Abingdon. As for me, she said, I shall be quite happy alone. I have no taste for pleasure, but I always like to know that others are enjoying themselves, even if I cannot. Eagerly responsive to such a welcome suggestion, the entire household repaired to the fair, except the hostess, Mrs. Owen, and a lady guest, and with them as companions, Amy Robsart spent a quiet and peaceful day. During the evening she rose suddenly from the card table at which the three ladies were playing, and left the room, and nothing more was seen of her until the servants returning from the fair found her dead body at the stair foot. Was it suicide or a brutal murder? The bucolic jury shrank from either conclusion and gave as their verdict accidental death. That Amy Robsart ended her own life is far from improbable, for it was no secret to her friends that she was weary of it and would welcome the release death alone could bring. But the general opinion, so far from supporting this plausible theory, turned to thoughts of murder and branded Dudley as slayer of his wife. It was even commonly whispered that he had bribed one of his minions, Anthony Foster, to hurl her down the stairs to her death. Whatever may be the truth, none could prove it then, and who shall succeed now? It is more generous and certainly more probable to suppose that Amy Robsart, by her own act, wilful, at the dictate of a brain disordered by grief, or accidental, removed the barrier to her husband's passion for his queen. Certain it is that Dudley affected, if he did not actually feel, deep sorrow at his wife's death, and that he spared no pains to solve the mystery that surrounded it. His grief, however, seems to have been short-lived, for before the unhappy Amy had been many months in her grave, we find him more ardent than ever in his devotion to Elizabeth, whose hand he was now free to claim. But the queen, who was nothing if not an arrant coquette, was in no mood to be caught, even by the man she loved. She drove him to distraction by her caprices. One moment she would rap him on the knuckles, only to smile her sweetest on him the next. One day she would flaunt in his face a patent of peerage as evidence of her affection. The next she would cut the parchment to pieces under his nose, laughing the while. She roused him to frenzies of jealousy by dallying with one royal offer of marriage after another. Now it was Philip, the Spanish king, now his Majesty of Sweden, canvassing their respective merits and charms in his presence, and flaring into angry retorts when he ventured to ridicule his august rivals. She carried her tortures even to the extent of seeming to encourage a match between her favourite and Mary Queen of Scots, and to make him a worthy suitor for a royal hand, granted him the peerage she had so long dangled before him. Robert Dudley, as Baron Denbigh and Earl of Leicester, was no unfit husband for her royal sister, certainly a much more possible personage than Sir Robert could have been, but she never intended thus to lose her most acceptable admirer, and was relieved, though she affected to be angry, when news came that Mary had chosen Darnley for her husband. Thus was Leicester's loss Elizabeth's gain, and his reward was that he took still a higher place in her favour. If he was not now king consort in name, he was at least in place and power. When the queen fancied she was dying of smallpox, she announced her wish that he should be appointed protector of the realm at a princely salary, and when she recovered, he was empowered to act as her deputy, to receive ambassadors, to interview ministers, and to sit in her seat at the deliberations of her council. To such an eminence had the favour of a queen raised the grandson of the country squire. No wonder it was commonly rumoured either that she was actually Dudley's wife, or that her relations with him were open to grave suspicion. "I am spoken of," she once bitterly said to the Spanish ambassador, "as if I were an immodest woman. I ought not to wonder at it. I have favoured him because of his excellent disposition and his many merits, but I am young, and he is young, and therefore we have been slandered. God knows they do us grievous wrong, and the time will come when the world knows it also. I do not live in a corner. 1,000 eyes see all I do, and calumny will not fasten on me for ever." But neither Elizabeth nor Dudley, or Leicester, as we must now call him, allowed these rumours and suspicions to affect even their familiarities, which were proclaimed to all on many a public occasion, as when the Earl once, during a heated game of tennis, snatched the Queen's handkerchief from her hand, and proceeded to wipe his perspiring forehead with it. To Elizabeth's passion for pomp and pageantry, Leicester was indispensable. It was he who arranged to the smallest detail her gorgeous progresses and receptions, culminating in that historic visit to Kenilworth in 1575, every hour of which was crowded with cunningly devised entertainments, from the splendid pageantry of her welcome through banquets and masquerades to hunting and bear baiting, all on a scale of lavish prodigality such as even that most gorgeous of queens had never known. Thus, for 30 long years, Leicester held his paramount place in the affections of his sovereign, a preeminence which was never seriously endangered, even when he seemed most disloyal and transferred to other women attentions of which she claimed a monopoly. When he flirted outrageously with my Lady Hereford, one of the loveliest women at court, she responded by coquetting openly with Sir Christopher Hatton, Lord Ormond, or Sir Thomas Heneage, and only laughed at the jealousy she aroused. If a man may flirt, she would mockingly say, why not a woman, especially when that woman is a queen? And of course to this question there was no other answer for my lord than to kiss and be friends, and to promise to be more discreet in the future. But the Earl was ever weak in the presence of beauty, and in spite of all his vows could not long be true even to his queen. He lost his heart to the lovely wife of Lord Sheffield, and when her husband died conveniently and mysteriously, it was said that Leicester, with his doctor's help, removed him by a dose of poison. It was not long before he wedded her in secret, only just in time to make her child, whose name Robert Dudley made no concealment of his parentage, legitimate. Before the child was many months old, however, the father was caught in the toils of another charmer, my Lady Essex, and after deserting his wife, and it is said unsuccessfully trying to poison her, he made Lady Essex his countess, in defiance of that secret wedding with Sheffield's widow. When news of this double treachery, with the ugly suspicions that attended it, reached the Queen's ears, her rage knew no bounds. She vowed that she would send her faithless lover to the Tower, that his head should pay forfeit for his false heart, and it was only when her anger had had time to cool that more moderate counsels prevailed, and she was content to banish him to a virtual prison at Greenwich. It was not long, however, before her heart, always weak where her sweet Robin was concerned, relented, and he was summoned back to court to resume his place at her side. In fact, his very falseness and his folly seemed to make him even dearer to the infatuated woman than his loyalty and his love-making had ever done. These days of silken ease were, however, soon to be changed. When in 1585 Elizabeth wished to send her soldiers to help Holland in the struggle with Spain, her choice fell on Leicester to take command of the expedition, though his only experience of war had been more than a quarter of a century earlier, when young Dudley had left the Tower and his fellow prince's captive side to give his sword its baptism of blood in Picardy. At Flushing and Leyden, Utrecht and Rotterdam, the great English Earl and friend of England's Queen was received with the rapturous homage due to a sovereign deliverer rather than to a subject. All Holland abandoned herself to a delirium of joy and festivity, and before he had been many weeks in the Netherlands, a heroic statue rose at Rotterdam in his honor, and he was invited with one clamorous and insistent voice to take his place as governor and dictator of the land he had come to save. Such a splendid lure was too potent for Leicester's ambition to resist. Without troubling to consult his sovereign at home, he accepted the throne that was offered to him, and it was only after 10 days had elapsed that he deigned to dispatch a messenger to Elizabeth with news of his promotion. Meanwhile, and long before his envoy, who was delayed by storms on his journey, could reach the English court, Elizabeth had heard news of her favourite's presumption, and her royal anger blazed into flame at his insolence in daring to accept such honours without consulting her pleasure. She promptly dispatched Sir Thomas Heneage, his whilom rival, to the Netherlands, armed with a scathing letter in which the Queen poured out the vials of her wrath on Leicester's head. "How contemptuously we conceive ourselves to have been used," she wrote. "You shall by the bearer understand. We could never have imagined, had we not seen it fall out in experience, that a man raised up by ourself, and extraordinarily favoured by us above any other subject of this land, would have in so contemptible a sort broken our commandment in a cause that so greatly toucheth us in honour. And therefore our express pleasure and commandment is that, all delays and excuses laid apart, you do presently, upon the duty of your allegiance, obey and fulfil whatsoever the bearer hereof shall direct you to do in our name. Whereof fail you not, as you will answer the contrary at your uttermost peril." One can imagine Leicester's feelings on reading such words of royal anger and reproach from the woman who had always shown such indulgence to him. His impulse was to resign his governorship forthwith, and to hasten back to London to beg forgiveness on his knees. But before he could give effect to this decision, he had learned that Burleigh had interceded for him with the Queen to such effect that, supported by a petition from the States General, he was to be allowed to retain his office with Elizabeth's reluctant consent. A few months of rule, however, were sufficient to disillusionize the Dutchman. Leicester proved as incapable to govern a country as to lead an army. His arrogance, his outspoken contempt for his subjects, his incompetence, and his capricious temper so thoroughly disgusted the nation that had welcomed him with open arms that he was asked to resign his office as unanimously as he had been invited to accept it, and in November of 1587 the Earl returned ignominiously to England, eager to repair his damaged credit by at least making peace with his Queen. To his delight, he was received with as much cordiality as if he had done naught at all to earn his lady's displeasure. Elizabeth had undoubtedly missed her favourite, her right-hand man. She had, in fact, become so accustomed to him that she could not be long happy unless he was at her side, and it was by her side that he rode and shared the acclamations with which her soldiers greeted her when she paid that historic visit to the camp at Tilbury on the eve of the Armada. But Leicester's adventurous life was now drifting to its close. His health had for some time given him cause for alarm, and in August 1588 he left his Kenilworth home to seek relief by taking baths and drinking healing waters. And from Rycott he wrote the last of his many letters to the Queen. "I most humbly beseech your Majesty," he wrote, "to pardon your poor old servant, to be thus bold in sending to know how my gracious lady doth, and what ease of her late pain she finds, being the chiefest thing in this world I do pray for is for her to have good health and long life. For my own poor case I continue still your medicine, and find it amend much better than with any other thing that hath been given me. Thus hoping to find perfect cure at the bath, with the continuance of my wonted prayer for your Majesty's most happy preservation, I humbly kiss your foot. From your old lodging at Rycott this Thursday morning, ready to take on my journey. By your Majesty's most faithful and obedient servant, R. Leicester." But the Earl was not destined to reach the baths. His course was run. He got as far on his journey as Coventry, and there, on the 4th of September, he drew his last breath. Some said that his end was hastened by a dose of poison administered by his Countess, eager to pursue unchecked her intrigue with Christopher Blunt; others, that she accidentally gave him a draught from a bottle of poison which he had designed for her, but neither suspicion seems to have any evidence to support it. Thus perished, little past the prime of life, a man who more than any other of his day drained the cup of pride and pleasure, to find its dregs exceeding bitter to the taste. End of chapter 21.
Chapter 22 of Love Romances of the Aristocracy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Follis. Love Romances of the Aristocracy by Thornton Hall. Chapter 22. Two Irish Beauties. In the winter of 1745, the city of Dublin was thrown into a state of high excitement by the appearance of a couple of girls from the wilds of Connaught whose almost unearthly beauty won the instant homage of every man, from His Excellency the Earl of Harrington, then Lord Lieutenant, to the sourest Jarvey who cracked a whip in her streets. To quote the pardonably extravagant language of a chronicler of the time, "They swam into the social firmament of the Irish capital like twin planets of dazzling splendour, eclipsing all other constellations, as if the pall of night had been drawn over them." They had grown to girlhood, so the story ran from mouth to mouth, in a ruinous thatched house in the shadow of Castle Coote, in County Roscommon, and were the daughters of John Gunning, a roystering, happy-go-lucky, dram-drinking squireen, whose most serious occupation in life was keeping the broker's men on the right side of his door. And at the time this story opens, they were living in a cottage, rented for a modest £8 a year, on the outskirts of Dublin, with their mother, who was a daughter of Lord Mayo. To say that all Dublin was at the feet of the Gunning sisters at the first sight of their lovely faces and dainty figures is an unadorned statement of fact. The young bloods of the capital were their slaves to a man, ready to spill the last drop of blood for them, and every gallant of the viceregal court drank toast to their beauty, and vied with his rivals to win a smile or a word from them. Peg Woffington, it is said, threw up her arms in wonder at the sight of them, and as she hugged each in turn, declared that she had never seen anything half so sweet, and Tom Sheridan went down on his knees in involuntary homage to the majesty of their beauty. It was Tom Sheridan who placed his stage wardrobe at their disposal when they were invited to the great viceregal ball in honour of King George's birthday, and, attired as Lady Macbeth and Juliet respectively, they danced the stately minuet and rollicking country dances with such grace and abandon that lords and ladies stopped in their dances and mounted on chairs and tables to feast their eyes on so rare and ravishing a sight. "With Betty as with Maria," says Mr. Frankfort Moore, "the art of the dance had become part of her nature. Her languorous eyes were in sympathy with the voluptuous movements of her feet and lithe body, and the curves made by her arms formed an invisible chain that held every one entranced. The caresses of her fingers, the coyness of her curtsies, the allurements of her movements, all the graces and charms inwoven that make up the poem of the minuet, became visible by the art of that exquisite girl, until all other dancers became commonplace by comparison." Such was the fascination of their beauty that, it is said, the sisters were one day drugged by a party of licentious admirers, whose guests they had innocently consented to be, and were actually being carried away by their ravishers, when Sheridan, who had got wind of the plot, appeared on the scene with a number of stout-armed friends and effected their rescue. But even Dublin was no suitable market for such peerless beauties, Mrs. Gunning decided. Through her they had the blood of the Plantagenets in their veins, and no man less than a duke or an earl, certainly not an Irish squire or impoverished lord, was a fitting match for her daughters. And so to England and London they were carried, flushed with their conquests, leaving broken hearts behind them, and heralded across the Channel by many a sonnet singing their beauty. But although each was equally fair, the sisters were by no means alike in their charms. Maria, all gladness and mirth, was a sprightly brunette, in whose laughing glances shone the fires of a pleasure-seeking soul, while Elizabeth, the younger, with soft blue eyes and dark golden hair, although infinitely more placid, was no less radiant than her dashing sister. Each was, to quote another description, divinely tall, with a figure of perfect symmetry, and a grace of dignity enhanced by the proud poise of the small Grecian head. Faultless also were the rounded arms and the hands with their long, slender, tapering fingers. All the portraits of Elizabeth reveal the same dainty, disdainful lips in the shape of a Cupid's bow, the long, slender nose, the half-drooping lids and lashes. In colouring there was the same delicacy. A soft ivory pallor shone in her face, a flush of pink warmed her cheeks, there was a gleam of gold as the sunbeams touched her light brown hair. Such, in the cold medium of type, were the two Irish sisters who took London by storm, and who made more noise than any of their predecessors since the days of Helen, in the summer of 1751. Their conquest was immediate, electrifying. London raved about the new beauties. They were the theme of every tongue, from the court to the meanest coffee house. Even Grub Street rubbed its eyes in amazement at the wonderful vision, and ransacked its dictionaries for superlatives, and the poets, with one accord, struck their lyres to a new inspiration. Whenever the sisters took their walks abroad, they were beset by a curious multitude, the press being once so great that one of the sisters fainted away and had to be carried home in her chair, while on another occasion their beaux were compelled to draw swords to rescue them from the mob. When, too, they once went to Vauxhall Gardens, they found themselves the centre of a mob of 8,000 spectators, struggling to catch a glimpse of their lovely faces or to touch the hem of their garments. When, in alarm, they sought refuge in a neighbouring box, the door was at once besieged by jostling, clamorous thousands, who were only kept at bay by the sword points of their escort. And when one day they visited Hampton Court, the housekeeper showed the company, who were lionizing the place, into the room where they were sitting, instead of into the apartment known as the beauty room, with the significant remark, "These are the beauties, gentlemen." With such universal and embarrassing homage, it is no wonder that all the gallants in town, from the rakish Duke of Cumberland downwards, were at the feet of the fair sisters, or that they had the refusal of many a coronet before they had been many weeks in London. Each sister counted her noble lovers by the score, and each soon capitulated to a favoured wooer. Among Maria's most ardent suitors was the Earl of Coventry, a grave young lord, of handsome person and courtly graces, who had singled himself out from them all by the ardour of his wooing, and to him Maria gave her hand. One March day in 1752 the world of fashion was thrown into a high state of excitement by reading the following announcement. On Thursday evening the Earl of Coventry was married to Miss Maria Gunning, a lady possessed of that exquisite beauty and of those accomplishments which will add grace and dignity to the highest station. As soon as the ceremony was over, they set out for Lord Ashburnham's seat at Charlton in Kent to consummate their nuptials. Of Lady Coventry, who seems to have been as vain and foolish as she was beautiful, many amusing stories are told. So annoyed was her ladyship by the crowds that still followed her when she took the air in St. James's Park, that she appealed to the king for an escort of soldiers, a favour which was readily granted to the most beautiful woman in England. Thus on one occasion we are told: "From 8 to 10 o'clock in the evening a strange procession paraded the crowded avenues, obliging everyone to make way and exciting universal laughter. In front marched 2 sergeants with their halberds, then tripped the self-conscious Lady Coventry, attended by her husband and an ardent admirer, the amorous Earl of Pembroke, while 12 soldiers of the guard followed in the rear." One day, so runs another story which illustrates her ladyship's lack of discretion, she was talking to King George II. who, in spite of his age, was a great admirer of beauty, and especially of my Lady Coventry. "Are you not sorry," his Majesty inquired, "that there are to be no more masquerades?" "Indeed, no," was the answer. "I am quite weary of them and of all London's sights. There is only one left that I am really anxious to see, and that is a coronation." This unflattering wish she was not destined to realise, for King George survived the foolish beauty by a fortnight. Lady Coventry had no greater admirer of her own charms than herself. She spent her days worshipping at the shrine of her loveliness, and embellished nature with every device of art. She squandered fortunes in adorning it with the most costly jewellery and dresses, of one of which the following story is told. One day she exhibited to George Selwyn a wonderful costume which she was going to wear at an approaching fête. The dress was a miracle of blue silk, richly brocaded with silver spots of the size of a shilling. "And how do you think I shall look in it, Mr. Selwyn?" she archly asked.
"Why," he replied, "you will look like change for a guinea."
Mrs. Delany draws a remarkable picture of my lady at this culminating period of her vanity. "Yesterday, after chapel," she writes, "the Duchess brought home Lady Coventry to feast me, and a feast she was. She is a fine figure and vastly handsome, notwithstanding a silly look sometimes about the month. She has 1,000 airs, but with a sort of innocence that diverts one. Her dress was a black silk sack, made for a large hoop, which she wore without any, and it trailed a yard on the ground. She had on a cobweb-laced handkerchief, a pink satin long cloak lined with ermine mixed with squirrel skins, on her head a French cap that just covered the top of her head, of blonde, and stood in the form of a butterfly with wings not quite extended. Frilled sort of lappets crossed under her chin, and tied with pink and green ribbon, a head-dress that would have charmed a shepherd. She had 1,000 dimples and prettinesses in her cheeks, her eyes a little drooping at the corners, but fine for all that." Such vanities may be pardoned in a woman so lovely and so spoiled by fortune, especially as her reign was fated to be as brief as it was splendid. She was, perhaps, too fair a flower to be allowed to bloom long in the garden of this world. Before she had been long a bride, consumption sowed its deadly seeds in her, and she drained the cup of pleasure with the fatal sword hanging over her head. She knew she was doomed, that all the medical skill in the world could not save her, and, with characteristic courage, she determined to enjoy life to its last dregs. She saw her beauty fade daily, and pathetically tried to conceal its decay by powders and paints. She grew daily weaker, but with a brave smile held her place in the vortex of gaiety. Even when the inevitable end was near, she insisted on attending the trial of Lord Ferrers for the murder of his steward. As Horace Walpole says, "The seats of the peeresses were not nearly full, and most of the beauties were absent. But, to the amazement of everybody, Lady Coventry was there, and, what surprised me more, looked as well as ever. I sat next but one to her, and should not have asked her if she had been ill. Yet they are positive she has few weeks to live. She was observed to be acting over all the old comedy of eyes with her former flame, Lord Bolingbroke, an unscrupulous rake, who seems to have striven for years to make her the victim of his passion." Her conduct, indeed, seems never to have been very discreet. "Her levities," says a chronicler of the time, "were very publicly talked of, and some gallantries were ascribed to her which were greatly believed. However, they were never brought home to her, and if she were guilty, she escaped with only a little private scandal, which generally falls to the lot of every woman of uncommon beauty who is envied by the rest of her sex." During the summer of 1760 the unhappy lady lay at the point of death in her stately home at Croom Court, bravely awaiting the end. "Until the last few days," says Mr. Horace Bleackley,
The pretty Countess lay upon a sofa, with a mirror in her hand, gazing with yearning eyes upon the reflection of her fading charms. To the end her ruling passion was unchanged, for when she perceived that her beauty had vanished, she asked to be carried to bed, and called for the room to be darkened and the curtains drawn, permitting none to look upon her pallid face and sunken cheeks. Thus, robbed of all that had made life worth living, and bitterly realizing the vanity of beauty, Lady Coventry drew her last breath on October 1st, 1760. 10 days later, 10,000 persons paid their last homage to her in Purton churchyard. 3 weeks before Maria Gunning blossomed into a countess, her younger sister Betty had been led to the altar under much more romantic conditions after one of the most rapid and impetuous wooings in the annals of love. A few weeks before she wore her wedding ring, the man who was to win her was not even known to her by sight, and what she had heard of him was by no means calculated to impress her in his favour. The Duke of Hamilton, while still young, had won for himself a very unenviable notoriety as a debauchee in an age of profligacy. He had drunk deep of every cup of questionable pleasure, and at an age when he should have been in the very prime of his manhood he was a physical wreck, his vitality drained almost to its last drop by shameful excesses. Such was the man who entered the lists against a legion of formidable rivals for the guerdon of Betty Gunning's hand. It was at a masquerade that he first seems to have set eyes on her, and at sight of her this jaded, worn devotee of pleasure fell headlong in love. Within an hour of being introduced, he was, Walpole says, making violent love to her at one end of the room, in my Lord Chesterfield's house, while he was playing at faro at the other. That is, he neither saw the bank nor his own cards, which were of £300 each. He soon lost 1,000. Such was the first meeting of the lovely Irish girl and the man whom she was to marry, a man who, even in the thraldom of a violent love, could not refrain from indulging his passion for gambling. So inflamed was he by this new beauty who had crossed his path, that, to quote our entertaining gossip again, 2 nights afterwards, being left alone with her while her mother and sister were at Bedford House, he found himself so infatuated that he sent for a parson. The doctor refused to perform the ceremony without license or ring. The Duke swore he would send for the Archbishop. At last they were married with the ring of the bed-curtain at half an hour after 12 at night at Mayfair Chapel. The Scotch are enraged, the women mad that so much beauty has had its effect. If the wooing be happy that is not long in doing, the new Duchess should have been a very enviable woman, as no doubt she was, for she had achieved a splendid match. The daughter of the penniless Irish squireen had won, in a few days, rank and riches, which many an earl's daughter would have been proud to capture, and although her ducal husband was debauched and damaged in his fortune and his person, he was her very slave, and, as far as possible to such a man, did his best to make her happy. Translated to a new world of splendour, the Irish girl seems to have borne herself with astonishing dignity and modesty. She might indeed have been cradled in a duke's palace, instead of in a dilapidated farmhouse in the wilds of Ireland, so naturally did she take to her new rôle. When her Grace, wearing her Duchess's coronet, made her curtsy to the King one March day in 1752, the crowd was so great that even the noble mob in the drawing-room clambered upon tables and chairs to look at her. There are mobs at the door to see her get into her chair, and people go early to get places at the theatre when it is known that she will be there. A few weeks after the marriage, the Duke of Hamilton conducted his bride to the home of his ancestors, and never perhaps has any but a royal bride made such a splendid progress to her future home. Along the entire route from London to Scotland she was greeted with cheering crowds struggling to catch a glimpse of the famous beauty, whose romantic story had stirred even the least sentimental to sympathy and curiosity.
When they stopped one night at a Yorkshire inn, 700 people, we are told, sat up all night in and about the house merely to see the Duchess get into her post-chaise the next morning. Arrived at her husband's Highland castle, she was received with honours that might almost have embarrassed a queen, and which must have seemed strange indeed to the woman whose memories of sordid life in that small cottage on the outskirts of Dublin were still so vivid. Indeed, no queen could have led a more stately life than was now opened to her. "The Duke of Hamilton," says Walpole, to whom the world is indebted for so much that it knows of the Gunning sisters, "is the abstract of Scotch pride. He and the Duchess at their own house walk into dinner before their company, sit together at the upper end of their own table, eat off the same plate, and drink to nobody under the rank of an earl. Would not indeed," the genial old chatterbox adds, "one wonder how they could get anybody, either above or below that rank, to dine with them at all. It is, indeed, a marvel how such a host could find guests of any degree sufficiently wanting in self-respect to sit at his table and endure his pompous insolence, the insolence of an innately vulgar mind, which, unhappily, is sometimes to be met even in the most exalted rank of life." Perhaps the proudest period in Duchess Betty's romantic life was when, with her husband, the Duke, she paid a visit in 1755 to Dublin, the dear, dirty city she had known in the days of her poverty and obscurity, when her greatest dread was the sight of a bailiff in the house, and her highest ambition to procure a dress to display her budding charms at a dance. Her stay in Dublin was one long, intoxicating triumph. "No queen," she said, "could have been more handsomely treated." Wherever she went she was followed by mobs, fighting to get a glimpse of her, or to touch the hem of her gown, and blissful if they could win a smile from the darling Duchess, who had brought so much glory to old Ireland. Her wedded life, however, was destined to be brief. Her husband had one foot in his premature grave when he put the curtain ring on her finger, but, beyond all doubt, his marriage gave him a new if short lease of life. She became a widow in 1758, and before she had worn her weeds 3 months, she had a swarm of suitors buzzing round her. The Duke of Bridgewater was among the first to fall on his knees before the fascinating widow, who, everybody now vowed, was lovelier than ever, but he proved too exacting in his demands to please her Grace. In fact, the only one of all her new wooers on whom she could smile was Colonel John Campbell, who, although a commoner, would one day blossom into a Duke of Argyll, and she gave her hand to handsome Jack, within 12 months of weeping over the grave of her first husband. "It was a match," Walpole says, "that would not disgrace Arcadia. Her beauty had made enough sensation, and in some people's eyes is even improved. She has a most pleasing person, countenance, and manner, and if they could but carry to Scotland some of our sultry English weather, they might restore the ancient pastoral life, when fair kings and queens reigned at once over their subjects and their sheep." It was under such Arcadian conditions that Betty Gunning began her second venture in matrimony, which proved as happy as its promise. Probably the 11 years which the Dowager Duchess had to wait for her next coronet were the happiest of her life, and when at last Colonel Jack became 5th Duke of Argyll, she was able to resume the life of stately splendour which had been hers with her first Duke. By this time her beauty had begun to show signs of fading. "As she is not quite so charming as she was," says Walpole, "I do not know whether it is not better to change her title than to retain that which puts one in mind of her beauty." But what she may have lost in physical charm she had gained in social prestige. She was appointed Lady of the Bedchamber to Queen Charlotte, and was one of the 3 ladies who acted as escort to the Princess Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz to the arms of her reluctant husband, George III. It is said that when the young German bride came in sight of the palace of her future husband, she turned pale and showed such signs of terror as to force a smile from the Duchess who sat by her side. Upon which the frightened young princess remarked, "My dear Duchess, you may laugh, for you have been married twice, but it is no joke for me." Her life as lady of the bedchamber appears to have been by no means a bed of roses, for Charlotte proved so jealous of the attentions paid to the beautiful Duchess by her husband, the King, that at one time she contemplated resigning her post. The letter of the resignation was actually written and dispatched, but her Grace, who did not approve altogether of its language, added this naive postscript before sending it: "Though I wrote the letter, it was the Duke who dictated it." Boswell, when describing a visit he paid to Inverary Castle, in Johnson's company, gives us no very favourable impression of the Duchess's courtesy as hostess. When the Duke conducted him to the drawing-room and announced his name, "The Duchess," he says, "who was sitting with her daughter and some other ladies, took not the least notice of me. I should have been mortified at being thus coldly received by a lady of whom I, with the rest of the world, have always entertained a very high admiration, had I not been consoled by the obliging attention of the Duke." During dinner, when Boswell ventured to drink her Grace's good health, she seems equally to have ignored him; and, while paying the utmost deference and attention to Johnson, the only remark she deigned to make to his fellow guest was a contemptuous, "I fancy you must be a Methodist." In fairness to the Duchess, it should be said that Boswell had incurred her grave displeasure by taking part against her in the famous Douglas case, in which she was deeply interested, and this was no doubt the reason why, for once, she forgot the elementary demands of hospitality as well as the courtesy due to her rank, and why, when Johnson mentioned his companion by name, she answered coldly, "I know nothing of Mr. Boswell." The Duchess saw her daughter, Lady Betty Hamilton, wedded to Lord Stanley, the future Earl of Derby, a union in which she paid by a life of misery for her mother's scheming ambition, and died in 1790, 30 years after her sister Maria drew the last breath of her short life behind drawn bed-curtains in her darkened room. To Betty Gunning, the squire's daughter, fell the unique distinction of marrying 2 dukes, refusing a third, and becoming the mother of 4 others, 2 of whom were successive Dukes of Hamilton and 2 of Argyll. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Love Romances of the Aristocracy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Follis. Love Romances of the Aristocracy by Thornton Hall. Chapter 23. The Mysterious Twins. A century and a half ago, the Douglas cause was a subject of hot debate, from John o' Groats to Land's End. It was discussed in court and castle and cottage, and was wrangled over at the street corner. It divided families and estranged friends, so fierce was the partisanship it generated, and so full was it of complexity and mystery that it puzzled the heads of the wisest lawyers. England and Scotland alike were divided into 2 hostile camps, one declaring that Archibald Douglas was son of Lady Jean Douglas, and thus the rightful heir to the estates of his ducal uncle, the other protesting with equal warmth and conviction that he was nothing of the sort. Dr. Johnson was a stalwart in one camp, Boswell in the other. Sir," Johnson said to his friend and biographer, "don't be too severe upon the gentleman. Don't accuse him of a want of filial piety. Lady Jane Douglas was not his mother." Whereupon
Boswell says, "He roused my zeal so much that I took the liberty to tell him that he knew nothing of the cause, which I most certainly do believe was the case." For 7 years the suit dragged its weary length through the courts. The evidence for and against the young man's claim covers 10,000 closely printed pages. But although Archibald won the Douglas lands, his paternity remains today as profound a mystery as when George III was new to his throne. 40 years before the curtain rose on this dramatic trial, which, Boswell declares, "shook the security of birthright in Scotland to its foundation," the Lady Jean, only daughter of James, 2nd Marquess of Douglas, was one of the fairest maids north of the Tweed. A girl who combined beauty and a singular charm of manner with such abounding vitality and strength of character that she did not require her high rank and royal descent to make her desirable in the eyes of suitors. She was, moreover, the only sister of the head of her family, the Duke of Douglas, who seemed little disposed to provide an heir to his vast estates, and these there seemed more than a fair prospect that she would one day inherit. It was thus but natural that many a wooer sought Lady Jean's hand, and had she cared for coronets, she might have had her pick of them. On the evidence of the man who ultimately became her husband, she refused those of the Dukes of Hamilton, Buccleuch, and Athol, the Earls of Hopetoun, Aberdeen, and Panmure, cum multis alis. However this may be, we know that she had several love romances, and that one at least nearly led to the altar while Jean was still a wee bit lassie. The favoured suitor was the young Earl of Dalkeith, heir to the Buccleuch dukedom, a young man who may have been, as Lady Louisa Stuart described him, of mean understanding and meaner habits, but who was at least devoted to her ladyship, and in many ways a desirable party. The Duchess of Buccleuch was frankly delighted with the projected marriage of her son with Lady Jean Douglas, a young lady whom she had heard much commended before she saw her, and who since had lost no ground with her. And no doubt the fair Douglas would have become Dalkeith's Countess had it not been for the treacherous intervention of her Grace of Queensberry, whose heart was set on the Earl marrying her sister-in-law. The marriage day had actually been fixed when a letter was placed in Lady Jean's hand when on her way to the court, a letter in which the Earl claimed his release as he no longer loved her. That the letter was a clever forgery never occurred to Lady Jean, who was so crushed by it that it is said she fled in disguise to France to hide her shame and her humiliation. Such was the tragic ending to Lady Jean's first romance, which gave her such a distrust of man and such a distaste for matrimony that for 30 years she vowed she would listen to no avowal of love, however tempting. During the long period, while youth was slipping from her, Lady Jean appears to have lived alone at Drumshoe House, near Edinburgh, where she made herself highly popular by her affability, admired for her gifts and graces of mind, and courted for her rank and her lavish hospitality, paying occasional visits to her brother, the Duke of Douglas, whose devotion to her was only equalled by the alarm his eccentric behaviour and his mad fits of jealousy and temper inspired in her. That the Duke, who is described as a person of the most wretched intellect, proud, ignorant, and silly, passionate, spiteful, and unforgiving, was scarcely sane, is proved by many a story, one alone of which is sufficient to prove that his mind must have been unbalanced. Once, when Captain Kerr, a distant cousin, was a guest at the castle, he ventured to remonstrate with his host on allowing his servants, especially one called Stockbrigg, to rule over him, whereupon "the poor Duke," to quote Woodrow, who for many years had been crazed in his brain, told this familiar, who persuaded him that such an insult could only be wiped out in blood, on which the Duke proceeded to Kerr's room and stabbed him as he was sleeping. It is little wonder that Lady Jane declined to live with a brother who was thus a slave to his own servants and to a temper so insane. But although their lives were led apart, and although, among many other mad delusions, the Duke was convinced that his sister had applied for a warrant to confine him as a madman, and she to sit down on the estate and take possession of it, he was generous enough to make her a liberal allowance, and to promise that, if she married and had children, they would heir his estate. Such was the state of affairs at the time this story really opens. Lady Jane had carried her aversion to men and matrimony to middle age, happy enough in her independence and extravagance, while the Duke, still unwed, remained a prey to his jealousies, his morbid fancies, and his insensate rages. And it is at this time that Colonel Stuart, the villain of the play, makes his appearance on the stage. 10 years earlier, it is true, John Stuart of Grandtully had tried to repair his shattered fortunes by making love to Lady Jean, who, although then a woman of nearly 40, was still handsome enough, as he confessed later, to captivate my heart at the first sight of her. She was, moreover, and this was much more to the point, a considerable heiress, with the vast Douglas estates as good as assured to her. But to the handsome adventurer Lady Jean turned a deaf ear, as to all her other suitors, and the Colonel, who had never won any army rank higher than that of a subaltern, had to return ignominiously to the Continent, where for another 10 years he picked up a precarious living at the gaming tables, by borrowing or by any other low expedient that opportunity provided to his scheming brain. The Duke of Douglas, who cordially detested this down-at-heels cousin, called him "one of the worst of men, a papist, a Jacobite, a gamester, a villain," and his career certainly seems to justify this sweeping and scathing description. Such was the man who now reappeared to put his fate again to the test, and this time with such success that, to quote his own words, "Very soon after I had an obliging message from Lady Jean, telling me that, very soon after my leaving Scotland, she came to know she had done me an injustice, but she would acknowledge it publicly if I chose. En fin, I was allowed to visit her as formerly, and in about 3 months after she honoured me with her hand." Was ever wooing and winning so strange, so inexplicable? After refusing some of the greatest alliances in the land, after turning her back on at least half a dozen coronets, this wilful and wayward woman gives her hand to the least desirable of all her legion of suitors, a man broken in fortune and of notorious ill fame, swashbuckler, gambler, and defaulter, a man, moreover, who was on the verge of old age, for he would never see his 60th birthday again. The Colonel's motive is manifest. He had much to gain and nothing to lose by this incongruous union. But what could have been Lady Jean's motive, and does the sequel furnish a clue to it? She was deeply in debt, thanks to her long career of extravagance, and, to crown her misfortune, her brother threatened to withdraw her annuity. But on the other hand, she was still, although nearly 50, a good-looking woman, appearing, we are told, at least 15 years younger than she really was, and thus might well have looked for a eligible suitor, while her marriage to a pauper could but add to her financial embarrassment. There remained the prospect of her brother's estates, which would almost surely fall to her children if she had any, if only to keep them out of the hands of the Hamiltons, whom the Duke detested.
and this consideration may have determined her in favour of this 11th-hour marriage, with its possibilities, however small, of thus qualifying for a great inheritance. Thus it was, whatever may be the solution of the mystery, that one August day in 1746 Lady Jean was led to the altar by her aged pauper lover, and a few days later the happy pair landed at Rotterdam, with a retinue consisting of a Mrs. Hewitt, Lady Jean's maid, and a couple of female servants, leaving her ladyship's creditors to wrangle over the belongings she had left behind at Edinburgh. From Rheims, to which town the wedding party journeyed, Lady Jean wrote to her man of business, Mr. Haldane. "It is mighty certain that my anticipations were never in the marrying way, and had I not at last been absolutely certain that my brother was resolved never to marry, I never should have once thought of doing it. But since this was his determined unalterable resolution, I judged it fit to overcome a natural disinclination and backwardness, and to put myself in the way of doing something for a family not the worst in Scotland, and therefore gave my hand to Mr. Stewart, the consequence of which has proved more happy than I could well have expected." Such was the unenthusiastic letter Lady Jean wrote on her honeymoon, assigning as her motive for the marriage a wish to do something for her family, which could scarcely be other than to provide heirs to the Douglas lands, an ambition which to the most sanguine lady of her age must have seemed sufficiently doubtful of realization. Then began a wandering life for the grotesque pair. Rheims, Utrecht, Geneva, Aix-la-Chapelle, Liège, and many other continental towns appear in turn on their erratic itinerary, the Colonel travelling as Lady Jean's maître d'hôtel, and never avowed by her as her husband, and at every place of halting my lady finds fresh victims for her clever tongue and ingratiating charm of manner, who, in return for her smiles and flatteries, keep her purse supplied. Now it is young Lord Blantyre who succumbs to her wiles, and follows her from place to place like a shadow, drawing large sums from his mother to lend to my Lady Jean, who is at a loss by not receiving letters which were to bring her remittances. Now it is Mr. Hay, Mr. Dalrymple, or some other susceptible admirer who obliges her by a temporary loan, and is amply rewarded by learning from her lips that he is "the man alive I would choose to be most obliged by." Thus, by a system of adroit flatteries, Lady Jean keeps the family exchequer so well replenished that she is able to take about with her a retinue consisting of 2 maids and a man-cook, in addition to the indispensable Mrs. Hewitt, and to ride in her carriage while her husband stakes his golden louis on the green cloth and drinks costly wines. Even such an astute man of the world as Lord Crawford she makes her devoted slave, ready at any moment to place his purse and services at her disposal, to the extent of breaking the news of her marriage to the Duke, her brother, and begging for his approval and favour, a task which must have gone considerably against the grain with the proud Scotsman. "I can assure your Grace," his lordship writes, "she does great honour to the family wherever she appears, and is respected and beloved by all that have the honour of her acquaintance. She certainly merits all the affectionate marks of an only brother to an only sister." This appeal, eloquent as it was, only seemed to fan the anger of the Duke, who, as he read it, declared to the parish minister who was present, "Why, the woman is mad. I once thought, if there was a virtuous woman in the world, my sister Jeanie was one. But now I am going to say a thing that I should not say of my own sister. I believe she is no better than... and that I believe there is not a virtuous woman in the world." At the very time, so inconsistent was this singular woman, that Lord Crawford, at her request, was breaking the news of her marriage to her brother. She was repudiating it indignantly to every person she met. To Lady Wigton she declared with tears that it was an infamous story raised by Miss Molycur, her cousin, in order to prejudice her brother against her, and that it had been so effectual that he had stopped her pension. And she begged Lady Wigton, when she went to England, to contradict it. But this nomadic, hand-to-mouth life could not go on indefinitely. The supply of dupes began to show signs of failing, and in her extremity she wrote urgent letters to friends in England and Scotland for supplies. She even borrowed from a poor Scottish minister almost the last penny he had. A crisis was rapidly approaching, which there was no way of escaping, unless the birth of a child might soften her brother's heart, and perchance reopen the vista of a great inheritance in the years to come. Such speculations must have occurred to Lady Jean at this critical stage of her fortunes, but whether what quickly followed was a coincidence, or, as so many asserted, a fraudulent plot to give effect to her ambition, it would need a much cleverer and more confident man than I to say. At any rate, from this failure of her purse, and of her hopes of propitiating, the Duke began all those mysterious suggestions and circumstances, of which so much was made in the trial of future years, and which heralded the birth of the desired heir, or, to make assurance doubly sure, in Lady Jane's case, heirs. As the expected event drew near, it became important to go to Paris in order to have the advantage of the best medical assistance, especially since Lady Jean was assured that the doctors of Rheims, where she was then living, were as ignorant as brutes. And so to the French capital she journeyed with her retinue, through 3 sultry July days in a public diligence devoid of springs. How trying such a journey must have been to a lady in her condition is evidenced by the fact that, during the 3 days, she spent 41 hours on the road, reaching Paris on the 4th of July. Just 6 days later, her ladyship, to quote a letter written by Mrs. Hewitt, produced 2 lovely boys, one of whom was so weak and puny that the doctor begged it might be sent to the country as soon as possible. So far the story seems clear and plausible, assuming that a lady in such a delicate state of health could bear the fatigues of so long and trying a journey as that from Rheims to Paris. But from this stage the mystery, which it took so many wise heads to penetrate in future years, begins to thicken. Although the children were said to have been born on the 10th of July, it was not until 11 days later that Mrs. Hewitt imparted the news to the 2 maids who had been left behind at Rheims, in the letter from which I have quoted. Further, although the Colonel wrote to 6 different people on the 10th, not one of his letters contains any reference to such an interesting event, which should, one would think, have excluded all other topics from a father's pen. Moreover, although the Colonel and his wife were, as the house books proved, staying on the 10th of July at the hotel of a Monsieur Godefroy, neither the landlord nor his wife had any knowledge that a birth had taken place, or was even expected, and it was beyond question that the lady left the house on the 13th, 3 days after the alleged event, without exciting any suspicion as to what had so mysteriously taken place. On the 13th, the Colonel and his lady, accompanied by Mrs. Hewitt, declared that they went for a few days to the house of a Madame Lebrun, a nurse, but no child, Monsieur and Madame Godefroy swore, accompanied them. And on the 18th of July, 8 days after the accouchement, they made their appearance at Michel's hotel, still without a solitary infant to show,
where Madame was already so far recovered that she spent the days in jaunting about Paris and making trips to Versailles. At Michel's the story they told was that the infants were so delicate that they had been sent into the country to nurse, and yet none had seen them go. But before the parents had been a day in their new quarters, the Colonel, after hours of absence, appeared with a child. A puny infant, but still unmistakably genuine. Thus one of the twins was accounted for. The other, they declared, was still more delicate and must be left in the country. It was quite certain that the children had not been born either at Godefroy's or Michel's hotel. As for the intermediate place of lodging, the most diligent later inquiries failed to discover either Madame Lebrun or the house in which she was supposed to live in the Faubourg Saint-Germain. Moreover, was it a coincidence that on the very day on which the Colonel at Michel's with one of the alleged children, it was proved that a foreign gentleman, exactly answering his description, had purchased, for 3 gold louis, a fortnight-old baby from its peasant parents, called Mignon, in a Paris slum? To add further to the confusion, both Colonel Stewart and Mrs. Hewitt in later years declared in the most positive manner, first, that the children had been born at Michel's, and secondly at Madame Lebrun's, in defiance of the facts that on the 10th of July, the alleged date of birth, the mother was beyond any doubt staying at Godefroy's hotel, that no such person as Madame Lebrun apparently existed, and that the only visible child at Michel's was a fortnight old. On the 7th of August, Lady Jean wrote to inform her brother, the Duke, that she had been blessed with 2 boys, one of which she begged his permission to call by his name, a letter which only had the effect of rousing his Grace's high passion and displeasure, with a threat to stop her annuity. For 16 months the second and more delicate infant was left with his country nurse, the mother never once taking the trouble to visit it, and then the Colonel and his wife made a mysterious journey to Paris, returning with another child, who, they alleged, was the weakling of the twins. Was it again a coincidence that at the very time when the second child made his appearance, another infant was purchased from its parents in Paris by a strange monsieur, who, if not the Colonel, was at least his double? And was it not strange that this late arrival should appear to be several months older than his more robust brother, as the purchased child was? At last, provided with 2 children, and having exhausted their credit on the Continent, Lady Jean and her husband turned their faces homeward, prepared to carry the war into the enemy's camp. Arrived in London, they set to work to win as many influential friends and supporters as possible, and this Lady Jean, with her plausible tongue, succeeded in doing. Lady Shaw and Eglinton, the Duke of Queensberry, Lord Lindores, Solicitor General Murray, later Lord Mansfield, and many another high-placed personage vowed that they believed her story and pledged their support. Mr. Pelham proved such a good friend to her that he procured from the King a pension of £300 a year, which she sorely needed, for at the time her husband was a prisoner for debt within the rules of the King's Bench. Even Lady Jean's enemies could not resist a tribute of admiration for the courage with which, during this time, she fought her uphill fight against poverty and opposition. Her affection for her children and her loyalty to her good-for-nothing husband were touching in the extreme, and, if not quite sincere, were most cleverly simulated. To all her appeals the Duke still remained obdurate, vowing he would have nothing to do either with his sister or the 2 nunnery children which she wanted to impose on him. In spite of her royal pension, Lady Jean only succeeded in getting deeper and deeper involved in debt, until it became clear that some decisive step must be taken to repair her fortunes.
Then it was that, at last, she screwed up her courage to pay the dreaded visit to her brother, in the hope that the sight of her children and the pathos of her personal pleading might soften his heart. One January day in 1753, one of the Duke's servants says, "She looked in at the little gate as I was passing through the court. She called, and I went to her, when she told me she was come to wait on the Duke with her children. I proposed to open the gate and carry in her ladyship, but she said she would not go in till I acquainted his Grace." The Duke, however, after consulting with his minion Stockbrigg, who still ruled the castle and its lord alike, sent word that he refused to see his sister, and the broken-hearted woman walked sadly away, to a letter in which she begged "to speak but a few moments to your Grace, and if I don't, to your own conviction, clear up my injured innocence, inflict what punishment you please upon me." He returned no answer. Trouble now began to fall thickly on Lady Jean. Her delicate child, Sholto, died after a brief illness. She was distracted with grief, and cried out in her deep distress, "Oh, Sholto, Sholto, my son Sholto, if I could but have died for you!" This last blow of fate seems to have completely crushed her. A few months later she gave up her gallant and hopeless struggle, but only with her life. Calling her remaining son to her bedside, she said with streaming eyes, "May God bless you, my dear son, and above all make you a worthy and honest man. For riches I despise them. Take a sword, and you may one day become as great a hero as some of your ancestors." Then, but a few moments before drawing her last breath, she said to those around her, "As one who is soon to appear in the presence of Almighty God, to whom I must answer, I declare that the 2 children were born of my body." Thus passed beyond these voices a woman who, whatever her faults, carried a brave heart through sorrows and trials which might well have crushed the proudest spirit. Lady Jean's death probably did more to advance her son's cause than all her scheming and courage during life. Influential friends flocked to the motherless boy, whose misfortunes made such an appeal to sympathy and protection. His father succeeded to the family baronetcy, and became a man of some substance. His uncle the Duke took to wife, at 62, his cousin, Peggy Douglas of Mainz, a lady of strong character who had long vowed that she would be Duchess of Douglas or never marry. And in Duchess Peggy, Archibald found his most stalwart champion, who gave her husband no peace until the Duke, after long vacillation and many maudlin moods, in which he would consign the brat to perdition one day, and shed tears over his pathetic plight the next, was won over to her side. To such good purpose did the Duchess use her influence that when her husband, the Duke, died in 1761, Colonel, now Sir John, Stuart was able to write to his elder son by his first marriage, "Dear Jack, I have not had time till now to acquaint you of the Duke of Douglas's death, and that he has left your brother Archie his whole estate." Thus did Lady Jean triumph 8 years after her scheming brain was stilled in death. The rest of this singular story must be told in few words, although its history covers many years and would require a volume to do adequate justice to it. Within a few months of the Duke's death, the curtain was rung up on the great Douglas case, which for 7 long years was to be the chief topic of discussion and dispute throughout Great Britain. Archibald's title to the Douglas lands was contested by the Duke of Hamilton and the Earl of Selkirk, the former claiming as heir male, the latter under settlements made by the Duke's father. Clever brains were set to work to solve the tangle in which the birth of the mysterious twins was involved. Emissaries were sent to France to collect evidence on one side and the other, notably Andrew Stuart, tutor to the young Duke of Hamilton, who seems to have been a perfect sleuth-hound of detective skill, and it was not until 1768 that the Scottish Court of Session gave its verdict by the Lord President's casting vote, 7 judges voting for and 7 against Lady Jean's son. The judges, we are told, took up no less than 8 days in delivering their opinions upon the cause, and at last, by the President's casting vote, they pronounced solemn judgment in favour of the plaintiffs. Meanwhile, 4 years earlier, Sir John Stuart had followed his wife to the grave, declaring just before his death, "I do solemnly swear before God, as stepping into eternity, that Lady Jean Douglas, my lawful spouse, did in the year 1748 bring into the world 2 sons, Archibald and Sholto, and I firmly believe the children were mine, as I am sure they were hers. Of the 2 sons, Archibald is the only one in life now." But Archibald Douglas was not long to remain out of his estates. On appeal to the House of Lords, the decree of the Scottish court was reversed, and the victory of Lady Jean's son was final and complete. Of his later career it remains only to say that he entered Parliament and was created a peer, and that he conducted himself in his exalted position with a dignity worthy of the parentage he had established. But although he became the father of 8 sons, 4 of whom succeeded him in the title, no grandson came to inherit his honours and estates, and today the Douglas lands, for which Lady Jean schemed and fought and laid down her life, have the Earl of Home for lord. End of chapter 23.
Chapter 24 of Love Romances of the Aristocracy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Love Romances of the Aristocracy by Thornton Hall. Chapter 24, The Maypole Duchess. For many a century, ever since her history emerged from the mists of antiquity, Germany never lacked a Schulenburg to grace her courts, to lead her armies, or to wear the mitre in her churches. They held their haughty heads high among the greatest subjects of her emperors. Their family tree bristled with marshals and generals, bishops and ambassadors, and they waxed so strong and so numerous that they came to be distinguished as Black Schulenburgs and White Schulenburgs, as our own Douglases were black and red. But not one of all the glittering array of its dignitaries raised the family name to such an eminence, a bad eminence, as one of its plainest daughters, Arengard Melusina von der Schulenburg, to give her full imposing name, who lived not only to wear the coronet of a Duchess of England, but to be as much a queen as ever there was in England. Fraulein Arengard and her brother, who, as Count Matthieu von der Schulenburg, was to win fame as the finest general in Europe of his day, were cradled and reared at the ancestral castle of Emden in Saxony. The Schulenburg women were never famed for beauty, but Arengard was by common consent the ugly duckling of the family, abnormally tall, angular, awkward, and plain-featured, one of the last girls in Germany equipped for conquest in the field of love. When she reached her 16th birthday, Arengard's parents were glad to pack her off to the court of Herrenhausen, where the family influence procured for her the post of maid of honor to the Electress Sophia of Hanover. At any rate, she was provided for, an important matter, for the Schulenburgs were as poor as they were proud, and she was too unattractive to get into mischief. But it is the unexpected that often happens, and no sooner had the Elector's son and heir George set eyes on the ungainly maid of honor than he promptly fell head over ears in love with her, to the amazement of the entire court, and to the disgust of his mother, and of his newly made bride, Sophia Dorothea of Zell. To George, an awkward, sullen young man of loutish manners and loose morals, the gaunt girl, with her plain, sallow face, was a vision of beauty. She appealed in some curious way to the animal in him, and before she had been many weeks at Herrenhausen, she was his avowed mistress, one of many. "Just look at that Mawkin," the Electress Sophia once exclaimed to Lady Suffolk, who was a guest at the Hanoverian court, "and think of her being my son's mistress." But to any other than his mother, George's taste in women had long ceased to cause surprise. The ugly and gross appealed to a taste which such beauty and refinement as his young wife possessed left untouched. He had markedly demonstrated this perverseness of fancy already by showering his favours on the Baroness von Kielmansegg, who was reputed to be his natural sister, by the way, a lady so ugly that as a child Horace Walpole shrieked at sight of her. She had, he recalls, 2 fierce black eyes, large and rolling, beneath 2 lofty arched eyebrows, 2 acres of cheeks spread with crimson, an ocean of neck that overflowed and was not distinguished from the lower part of her body, and no part of it restrained by stays. No wonder, he adds, that a child dreaded such an ogress. Such were the 2 chief favourites of this unnatural heir to the throne of Hanover, who by a curious turn of fortune's wheel was to wear the English crown as the first of the Georges. In the company of these ogresses, and of a brace of Turkish attendants, George loved to pass his time in beer-guzzling and debauchery, while his beautiful and insulted wife sought solace in that ill-starred intrigue with Koenigsmark, which was to lead to his tragic death, and her own 30 years' imprisonment in the Schloss Alden, where she, who ought to have been England's queen, ate her heart out in loneliness and sorrow. To George, his wife's intrigue was a welcome excuse for getting rid of her, a license for unfettered indulgence in his low tastes, and the tragedy of her eclipse but added zest and emphasis to his unfettered enjoyment of life. In the hands of von der Schulenburg, the weak-minded, self-indulgent prince was as clay in the hands of the potter. She moulded him as she willed, for she was as crafty and diplomatic as she was ill-favoured. Madame Kielmansegg was relegated to the shade, while she stood in the full limelight. She bore 2 daughters to her royal lover, daughters who were called her nieces, although the fiction deceived nobody, and as the years passed, each adding, if possible, to her unattractiveness, her hold on the prince became still stronger. 30 years passed thus at the Herrenhausen court, when the death of Queen Anne made the high and mighty Prince George Elector of Hanover, rightful King of Great Britain, France, and Ireland. The sluggish, sensual life of the Hanoverian court was at an end. George was summoned to a great throne, and no king ever accepted a crown with such reluctance and ill grace. He would and he would not. For 3 weeks the English envoys tried every artifice to induce him to accept his new and exalted role, and finally they succeeded. But even then he had not counted on the fair Erengard. She refused point blank to go with him to that odious England, where chopping off heads seemed to be a favourite pastime. She was quite happy in Hanover, and there she meant to stay. She fumed and raged, ran about the palace gardens, embracing her dearly loved trees and clinging hysterically to the marble statues, declaring that she could not and would not desert them. And thus George left her, to start on his unwelcome pilgrimage to England. Madame von Kielmansegg, however, was of another mind. If her great rival would not go, she would, and after giving the Elector a day's start, she raced after him, caught him up, and to her delight was welcomed with open arms. The moment von der Schulenburg heard of the trick that Kielmansegg woman, had played on her, she too packed her trunks, and taking her nieces with her, also set out in hot pursuit of her royal lover and tool, and overtook him just as he was on the point of embarking for England. George was now happy and reconciled to his fate, for his retinue was complete. And what a retinue! When the king landed at Greenwich with his grotesque assortment of ministers, his hideous Turks, his two mistresses, one a gaunt giant, the other rolling in billows of fat, and his nieces, the crowds thronging the landing place and streets greeted the menagerie with jeers and shouts of laughter. They nicknamed Schulenburg the Maypole, the Kielmansegg the Elephant, and pursued the cavalcade with strident mockeries and insults. "Good peoples, why you abuse us?" asked the Maypole, protruding her gaunt head and shoulders through the carriage window. "We only come for all you goods, and for all our chattels, too. You," came the stinging retort from a wag in the crowd. But Schulenburg soon realized that she could afford to smile and shrug her scraggy shoulders at the insolence of those horrid English. She found herself in a land of Goshen, where there were many rich plums to be gathered by far-reaching and unscrupulous hands such as hers. If she could not love the enemy, she could at least plunder them. And this she set to work to do with a good will, while the plastic George looked on and smiled encouragement. There were pensions, appointments, patents, boons of all kinds to be trafficked in, and who had a greater right to act as intermediary than herself, the king's chère amie and right hand? She sold everything that was saleable. As Walpole says, she would have sold the king's honour at a shilling advance to the best bidder. From Bolingbroke's family she took £20,000 in three sums, one for a peerage, another for a pardon, and the third for a fat post in the customs. Gold poured in a ceaseless and glittering stream into her coffers. She refused no bribe if it was big enough, and was ready to sell anything from a dukedom to a bishopric if her price was forthcoming. She made George procure her a pension of £7,500 a year, 10 times as much as had long contented her well in Hanover, and when valuable posts fell vacant, she induced him to leave them vacant and to give her the revenues. Not content with filling her capacious pockets, she sighed for coronets, and got them in showers. 4 Irish peerages, from Baroness of Dundalk to Duchess of Munster, were flung into her lap, and yet she was not happy. She must have English coronets, and the best of them. So George made her Baroness of Glastonbury, Countess of Feversham, and Duchess of Kendal. And to crown her ambition for such baubles, he induced the pliant German emperor to make her a princess of Eberstein. Thus, with coffers overflowing with ill-gotten gold, her towering head graced with a dazzling variety of coronets, this grim idol of a king who at 60 was as much her slave as in the 20s, was the proudest woman in England, patronizing our own duchesses and snubbing peeresses of less degree. She might be a Maypole, hated and unattractive, but at least she towered high above all the fairest and most blue-blooded beauties of her consort's court. When the South Sea bubble rose to dazzle all eyes with its iridescent splendors, it was she more than any other who blew it. She was the witch behind the scenes of the South Sea and many another bubble company, whether its object was to carry on a thing that will turn to the advantage of the concerned, the breeding and providing for natural children, or for planting mulberries in Chelsea Park to breed silkworms. Every day of this wild, insane gamble, which wrecked thousands of homes and filled hundreds of suicides' graves, brought its stream of gold to her exchequer, and when the bubbles burst in havoc and ruin, she smiled and counted her gains, turning a deaf ear to the storm of execration that raged against her outside the palace walls. She knew that she had played her cards so skillfully that all the popular rage was impotent to harm her. Only one of her many puppets, Knight, the treasurer of the South Sea Company, could be the means of doing her harm. If he were arrested and told all he knew, impeachment would probably follow, with a sentence of imprisonment and banishment. But the crafty German was much too old a bird to be caught in that way. She packed Knight off to Antwerp, and through the influence of her friend, the German Empress, the States of Brabant refused to give him up to his fate. The Duchess of Kendal was now at the zenith of her power and splendor, while Sophia Dorothea, the true Queen of England, was pining away in solitude in distant Alden. The German Maypole was queen in all but name, ruling alike her senile paramour and the nation with a tactful if iron hand. It is said that she was actually the morganatic wife of George, that the ceremony had been performed by no less a dignitary than the Archbishop of York. But whether this was so or not, it is certain that this old and forbidding skeleton of a giantess was more England's queen than any other consort of the Georges. She was present at every consultation between the king and his ministers. Indeed, the conferences were invariably held in her own apartments every day from 5 till 8. She understood and humored every whim of her royal partner with infinite tactfulness, to the extent even of encouraging his amours with young and attractive women, while she herself, to emphasize her platonic relations with him, affected an extravagant piety, attending as many as 7 Lutheran services every Sunday. The only rival she had ever feared and hated, Madame Kielmansegg, had long passed out of power, and as Countess of Darlington was too much absorbed in pandering to her mountain of flesh and filling her pockets to spare a regret for the royal lover she had lost. When George, on hearing of the death of his unhappy wife, Sophia Dorothea, set out on his last journey to Hanover, his only companion was the Duchess of Kendal, the woman to whose grim fascinations he had been loyal for more than 40 years, and it was she who closed his eyes in the palace of Osnabrück, in which he had drawn his first breath 67 years earlier. A French fortune-teller had warned him that he would not survive his wife a year, and as he neared Osnabrück, the home of his brother, the Prince Bishop, his fatal illness overtook him. When he arrived at Ippenburen, he was quite lethargic. His hand fell down as if lifeless, and his tongue hung out of his mouth. He gave, however, signs enough of life by continually crying out, as well as he could articulate, Osnabrück, Osnabrück. As night fell, the sweating horses galloped into Osnabrück. An hour later, George died in his brother's arms, less than 12 months after his wife had drawn her last breath in her fortress prison of Alden. The Duchess of Kendal was disconsolate. She beat her breasts and tore her hair, and separating herself from the English ladies in her train, took the road, where she remained in close seclusion about 3 months. Returning to England, to the only solace left to her, her money-bags, she spent the last 17 years of her life alternating between her villas at Twickenham and Isleworth. George had promised her that if she survived him, and if it were possible, he would revisit her from the spirit world. When, to quote Walpole again, one day a large raven flew into one of the windows of her villa at Isleworth, she was persuaded that it was the soul of the departed monarch, and received and treated it with all the respect and tenderness of duty till the royal bird or she took their last flight. Thus, shorn of all her powers and splendor, in obscurity, and hoarding her ill-gotten gold, died the most remarkable woman who has ever figured in the British peerage. Her vast fortune was divided between her 2 nieces, one of whom, created by her father, George, Countess of Walsingham, became the wife of that polished courtier and heartless man of the world, Philip, 4th Earl of Chesterfield. End of chapter 24.
Chapter 25 of Love Romances of the Aristocracy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Follis. Love Romances of the Aristocracy by Thornton Hall. Chapter 25. The Romance of Family Trees. Such are a few of the scenes which arrest the eyes as the panorama of our aristocracy passes before them. But it would require a library of volumes to do anything like adequate justice to the infinite variety of the dramas it presents. There is, for instance, a whole realm of romance in the origins of our noble families, whose proud palaces are often reared on the most ignoble of foundations, and whose family trees flaunt, with questionable pride, many a spurious branch, while burying from view the humble roots from which they derive their lordly growth. Although Cobden's assertion that the British aristocracy was cradled behind city counters errs on the side of exaggeration, there is no doubt that in the veins of scores of the proudest English peers runs the blood of ancestors who served customers in city shops. When, a couple of centuries ago, John Baring, son of the Bremen Lutheran parson, Dr. Franz Baring, opened his small cloth manufactory on the outskirts of Exeter, his most extravagant ambition was to build up a business which he could hand over to his sons and to provide a few comforts for his old age. If any one had told him that he was laying the foundations of 4 families which should hold their heads proudly among the highest in the land, he would no doubt have laughed aloud. Yet John Baring lived to see his only daughter wedded to John Dunning, who made a baroness of her. Of his 4 sons, Francis was created a baronet by William Pitt, and found a wife in the cousin and co-heir of his Grace of Canterbury. The second son of this union, Alexander, was raised to the peerage as Baron Ashburton, won a millionaire bride in the daughter of Senator Bingham of Philadelphia, and from the immense scale of his financial operations was ranked by the Duc de Richelieu as one of the 6 great powers of Europe, England, France, Russia, Austria, and Prussia being the other 5. Sir Francis's eldest grandson, after serving in the exalted offices of Chancellor of the Exchequer and First Lord of the Admiralty, was created Baron Northbrook, a peerage which his son raised to an earldom. A second grandson qualified for a coronet as Baron Revelstoke, and a third is known today as Earl Cromer, the maker of modern Egypt, with half an alphabet of high dignities after his name. At least 3 dukes, Northumberland, Leeds, and Bedford, count among their forefathers many a humble tradesman. Glancing down the pedigree of his Grace of Northumberland, we find among his direct ancestors such names as these: William le Smithson of Thornton Watless, husbandman; William Smithson of Newsham, husbandman; Ralph Smithson, tenant farmer; and Anthony Smithson, yeoman. It was this Anthony whose son Hugh left the paternal farm to serve behind the counter of Ralph and William Robinson, London haberdashers, and thus to take the first step of that successful career which made him a baronet and a man of wealth. From Hugh, the London prentice, sprang in the 4th generation that other Hugh who won the hand of Lady Elizabeth Seymour, and with it the vast estates and historic name of Percy. Some years before Hugh Smithson, the farmer's son, set foot in London streets,
Edward Osborne left the modest family roof at Ashford in Kent to serve his apprenticeship to, and sit at the board of, William Hewitt, a merchant of Philpot Lane, who shortly after moved his belongings to a more fashionable home on London Bridge. One day it chanced that while his only daughter, the fair Mistress Anne, was hanging her favourite bird outside the parlour window, she lost her balance and fell into the river, then racing in high tide under the arches of the bridge. Fortunately for Mistress Anne, the young apprentice saw the accident. Quick as thought, he threw off his shoes and surcoat, and plunging into the swollen waters, caught the maiden by her hair as she was being swept away, and with difficulty dragged her to a passing barge, on which both found safety. There was only one proper sequence to this romantic incident. Mistress Anne lost her heart to her gallant rescuer. The grateful parents smiled on his wooing, and one fine August morning, not many months later, the wedding bells of St. Magnus Church were spreading far and wide the news that young Osborne had found a bride in one of the fairest and richest heiresses of London town. In due time Osborne became, as his father-in-law had been before him, Lord Mayor of London. The son of this romantic alliance was knighted for prowess in battle. Edward Osborne's grandson was made a baronet, and his great-grandson, Sir Thomas, added to the family dignities by becoming in turn Baron, Viscount, Earl, and Marquis, and finally Duke of Leeds. Thus only 2 generations separated the 'prentice lad of Philpot Lane from his descendant of the strawberry leaves, the first of a long and still unbroken line of English dukes, whose blood has mingled with that of many noble families. The noble house of Ripon has its origin in Yorkshire tradesmen who carried on business in York, some of whom were Lord Mayors of that city 2 or 3 centuries ago. These early Robinsons added to their fortune and enriched their blood by alliances with some of the oldest families in the north of England, such as the Metcalfes of Napa and the Redmaynes of Fulford, and slowly but surely laid the foundation of one of the wealthiest and most distinguished of great English houses. For 4 generations the head of the family was a cabinet minister, while one of them was Prime Minister of England. The Marquis of Bath derived descent from one John O'Thyn, who was, probably, a worthy publican of Church Stretton, and who was descended in the 7th generation from William de Botteveld, an under forester of Shropshire in the 13th century, while through his mother the late Marquis of Salisbury derived a strain of 'prentice blood from Sir Christopher Gascoigne, the first Lord Mayor of London to live in the Mansion House. Until a few years ago there might be seen in the main street of the village of Appletreewick in Yorkshire a single-storey cottage, little better than a hovel, which was the cradle of the noble family of Craven. It was from this humble home that William Craven, the young son of a husbandman, fared forth one day in the carrier's cart to seek fortune in far-away London town. Like many another boy who has taken a stout heart and an empty pocket to the metropolis as his sole capital, he fought his way to wealth, and before he died he was addressed as "my lord" in his character of London's chief magistrate. The eldest son of this peasant boy won fame as a soldier, became the confidential friend of his sovereign, and was created in turn a baron, a viscount, and earl of Craven. He died unwed, and all his wealth and dignities passed to a kinsman who, like himself, traced his descent from the peasant stock of Appletreewick. The Earls of Denbigh have for ancestor one Godfrey Fielding, who served his apprenticeship in London City, made a fortune as a Milk Street mercer, and was Lord Mayor when Henry VI was king. 5 years later, we may note in passing, London had for chief magistrate Godfrey Boleyn, whose great-granddaughter wore the crown of England as Queen Elizabeth. The present Earl of Warwick, whose title was once associated with such names as Plantagenet, Neville, Newburgh, and Beauchamp, has in his veins a liberal strain of prentice blood. The founder of the family fortunes was William Greville, citizen and wool stapler of London, who died 5 centuries ago after amassing considerable wealth, while another ancestor was Sir Samuel Dashwood, vintner, who, as Lord Mayor, entertained Queen Anne at the Guildhall in 1702, and found a husband for his daughter in the 5th Lord Broke. The father of the noble house of Dudley was William Ward, the son of poor Staffordshire parents, who was apprenticed to a goldsmith and made a fortune as a London jeweller. In the latter half of the 17th century, Nottingham had among its citizens a respectable draper named John Smith, who, it is said, made himself useful to his farmer customers in the intervals of selling tapes and dress materials to their wives, by helping them with their accounts. John lived and died an honest draper, and never aspired to be anything else. But his descendants were more ambitious. From drapers they blossomed into bankers and members of Parliament, and in 1796 George III departed for once from his rule never to raise a man of business to the peerage by converting Robert Smith into Baron Carrington. His successor abandoned the patronymic Smith for his title name, and the present-day representative of John Smith, the Nottingham draper, is Charles Robert Wynne Carrington, 1st Earl Carrington, Privy Council of the United Kingdom, Knight Grand Cross of the Order of St. Michael and St. George, and joint hereditary Lord Chamberlain of England. When William Capel left the humble paternal roof at Stoke Nayland in Suffolk to see what fortune and a brave heart could do for him in London, it certainly never occurred to him that his name would be handed down through the centuries by a line of earls, viscounts, and barons. Fortune had indeed strange experiences in store for the Suffolk youth, for, while she made a knight and Lord Mayor of him, she consigned him on a life sentence to the Tower for resisting the extortions of the mercenary Henry VII. Sir William's son won his knightly spurs on French battlefields, wedded a daughter of the ancient house of Roos of Belvoir, and became the ancestor of the Barons Capel, Viscounts Malden, and Earls of Essex. The Earls of Radnor owe their rank and wealth to the enterprise which led young Lawrence de Bouveries from his native Flanders to a commercial life at Canterbury in the days of Queen Bess. From this humble Flemish apprentice sprang a line of Turkey merchants, each of whom in turn added his contribution to the family dignities and riches, until Sir Jacob, the 3rd Baronet, blossomed into a double-barrelled peer as Lord Longford and Viscount Folkestone. Not the least by any means of the descendants of Lawrence de Bouveries was Canon Pusey, the great theologian, who was grandson of the 1st Lord Folkestone. Lord Harewood springs from a stock of merchants who accumulated great wealth in the 18th century, and Lord Jersey owes much of his riches to Francis Child, the industrious apprentice who in Stuart days married the daughter of his master, William Wheeler, the goldsmith, who lived one door west of Temple Bar. Other peers who count London apprentices among their ancestors are Lord Aveland and Viscount Downe, both descendants of Gilbert Heathcote, whose commercial success was crowned by the Lord Mayoralty in 1711, the Marquis of Bath, a descendant of Lord Mayor Hayward, whose 16 children are all portrayed in his monument in St. Alphege Church, London Wall, and also of Richard Gresham, mercer,
who waxed rich from the spoils of the monasteries, and whose son was founder of the Royal Exchange. The Earl of Eldon owes his existence to that runaway exploit which linked the lives of John Scott, the Newcastle tradesman's son, and Miss Surtees, the banker's daughter. If George III, during his lengthy reign, only raised one businessman to the peerage, later years have provided a very liberal crop of coroneted men of commerce. To mention but a few of them, banking has been honoured, and the peerage also, by the baronies granted to Lords Aldenham and Avebury. Lords Hindlip, Burton, Ivia, and Ardilaun owe their wealth and rank to successful brewing. Baron Overton was proprietor of large chemical works. Lord Allerton's riches have been drawn from his tan pits. Lord Armstrong's millions come from the far-famed Elswick engine works at Newcastle, and Lord Masham's from his mills at Manningham. The Viscounty of Hambledon has sprung from a modest news shop in the Strand. The barony of Burnham was cradled in a newspaper office, and Lords Mount Stephen and Strathcona were shepherd boys 70 years or more ago, before they found their way through commerce to the roll of peers. Although these lowly origins are as firmly established as Holy Writ, and are in most cases as well known to the noble families who trace rank and riches from them as to the expert in genealogy, they are often as carefully excluded from the family tree as the poor and undesirable relation from the doors of their palaces. Not content with the lineage extending over long centuries, and with a score of strains of undoubted blue blood, many of our greatest nobles and oldest gentle families strain after an ancestry which is not theirs, and throw overboard some obscure forefather to find room for a mythical Norman marauder, who in many cases exists nowhere but in the place of honour on their own pedigrees.
"What are pedigrees worth?" asked Professor Freeman. "I turn over a peerage or other book of genealogy, and I find that, when a pedigree professes to be traced back to the times of which I know most in detail, it is all but invariably false. As a rule, it is not only false, but impossible. The historical circumstances, when any are introduced, are for the most part not merely fictions, but exactly that kind of fiction which is, in its beginning, deliberate and interested falsehood."
This scathing criticism refers to pedigrees which profess to be based on existing records. What shall we say, then, of those family trees which have their ambitious roots in the dark centuries which no ray of genealogical light can possibly pierce? Take, for instance, that amazing pedigree of the Light family of Lights Carey, at the head of which is Lytus, one of the 5 captains of Boeotia that went to Troy, whose ancestors came to England first with Brute, the most noble founder of the Britons. It is only fair to say that the present representative of this really ancient family, Sir H. Maxwell Lyte, an expert genealogist, turns his back resolutely on the Boeotian captain, and even on Brute himself, and generally lops his family tree in a merciless but most salutary fashion. The College of Arms, among many amazing pedigrees, treasures one of a family whose present representative is 67th in descent in an unbroken male line from Belinus the Great, Beli Mar, King of Britain, which actually exhibits the arms of Beli, who, poor man, died long centuries before heraldry was even cradled. Of families who derive descent from Charlemagne, the name is legion, but even such elongated pedigrees are quite contemptible in their brevity, compared with others which have at their head no other progenitor than Adam, the father of us all.
At Mostyn Hall we learn there is a vellum roll 21 feet long of pedigrees, some of which are traced back to Adam, son of God, without any conscious sense of the incongruous, and these records, we must remember, are in the hand of a man thoroughly trustworthy as to the matters of his own time. There is in the College of Arms a similar family tree, which commences boldly with Adam and the Garden of Eden, and an authority on Welsh pedigrees declares: "A Welshman whose family was in any position in the 16th century can, as a rule, without much trouble, find a pedigree thence to Adam. An Englishman who is unable to do the same has a natural tendency to regard all Welsh pedigrees with distrust, not to say contempt." Mr. Horace Round gives some startling examples of flagrant dishonesty, where forgery is only one of the implements used. Take, for example, that shameful story of the Shipway frauds, which is thus referred to by a clergyman of the parish. In the fall of 1896, by an elaborate system of impudent frauds, an unscrupulous attempt was made to claim these monuments for one who was an entire stranger to the parish. An agent from London was employed in a search for a pedigree. He, by fraudulent means, concocted a very plausible story. Genealogies were manufactured, tombs were desecrated, registers were falsified, wills were forged. In a word, various outrages were committed, with many sacred things in this parish and elsewhere. These two figures, as part of the pedigree, were deposited in a niche in the chantry. On either side were huge brass tablets, on which were engraven various untruthful and unfounded statements. In another case, Hughenden Church was desecrated to gratify the vanity of a family of Wellesbourne, anxious to trace their descent from the Montforts. They caused a monumental effigy of an imaginary ancestor to be carved in the style of the 13th century. They adapted the plate armor effigy to their purpose by cutting similar arms on the skirts, and they had 3 rude effigies fabricated by way of filling up the gaps between the 14th and 16th centuries. To give but 2 more out of many cases of similar imposture, the Deardens, many years ago, actually had a family chapel constructed in Rochdale Church, with sham effigies, slabs, and brasses to the memory of wholly fictitious ancestors, while in 2 Scottish churches altar tombs were placed to the memory of successive apocryphal lairds of Coulthart. Such are the lengths to which a craze for ancestry has carried some unprincipled persons, and there is no doubt that the arts of the forger are still enlisted in the service of people who crave long descent and do not scruple as to the methods by which they attain it. Happily, however, the mania for ancestors does not often take such extreme and reprehensible forms. Its manifestations are usually rather amusing than criminal. A common weakness is, however plebeian and obvious in its origin a surname may be, to dignify it with a Norman or at least French cradle. Thus, we are solemnly assured that the Smithsons, a name which bluntly proclaims its own derivation, are a branch of the baronial family of Scalers or de Scalaris, which flourished in Aquitaine as long ago as the 8th century. The first Cooper was not, as the unlearned might imagine, a modest if respectable tradesman of that name. No, he was a member of the great house of de Columbers, one of whom was Le Couper, being probably cup-bearer to the king. Pindar, the patronymic of the Earls Beauchamp, is of course a translation of the Norman La Bailey, and its bearers are probably descended from William, a Norman of distinction, while at least one family of Browns springs lineally from Turulf, a companion of Rollo, founder of the ducal house of Normandy. After this, one learns with meek resignation that the honourable cognomen Smith is derived from Smeath, a level plain, and that some at least of the Parker family had for ancestors certain de Lyons, who flourished bravely under William the Conqueror. Another favourite vanity is to glorify a name by the prefix de, a particle which has been all but unknown in England since the first half of the 15th century, and which has never possessed in Great Britain that nobiliary character which the French nation have chosen to assign to it. De Bath, de Trafford, and the rest are restorations in the modern Gothic manner. It is, we fear, a similar vanity which has displaced such modest surnames as Bear, Hunt, Wilkins, Mullins, Green, and Gossip, in favour of de Beauchamp, de Vere, de Winton, de Moleyns, de Freville, and de Rhodes. This ludicrous yearning for a Norman ancestry is responsible for many of the absurdities in the pedigrees of even our most exalted families. Thus it is that we find such statements as this widely circulated, and accepted with a quite childlike credence. This noble family, Grosvenor, is descended from a long train in the male line of illustrious ancestors, who flourished in Normandy with great dignity and grandeur from the time of its first erection into a sovereign dukedom, A.D. 912, to the conquest of England. The patriarch of this ancestral house was an uncle of Rollo, the famous Dane. And again, the blood of the great Hugh Lupus, Duke of Chester, flows in the Grosvenor veins. This pleasing fiction still rears its head unabashed, in spite of all attempts to destroy it. In its honour, the late Duke of Westminster was actually named Hugh Lupus at the baptismal font, while his younger brother was labelled Richard de Aquila. And yet it is an indisputable fact that the Grosvenor ancestors cannot be carried beyond a Robert de Grosvenor of Budworth, who lived a good century after the Conquest, and who has no more traceable connection with Rollo than with the Man in the Moon. The ducal house of Fife, we are told, derives from Fife Macduff, a chief of great wealth and power, who lived about the year 834, and afforded to Kenneth II, King of Scotland, strong aid against his enemies, the Picts. The present Duke, however, has the good sense to disclaim any hereditary connection with the old Earls of Fife, and to place at the top of his family tree one Adam Duff, who laid the foundation of the family prosperity in the 17th century. The Spencers, it is claimed, spring lineally from the old baronial Despensers, being a branch issuing from the ancient family and chief of the Spencers, of which sometimes were the Earls of Winchester and Gloucester, and Barons of Glamorgan and Morganach. This, no doubt, is a very distinguished origin, but alas, the earliest provable ancestors of this noble family were respectable and well-to-do Warwickshire graziers, and the first authentic title on the true pedigree is the knighthood conferred on John Spencer in 1519, less than 4 centuries ago. Similarly, the Russells, Dukes of Bedford, are said to be derived from one Hugh de Russell, or Rossel, who took that name from his estate in Normandy, one of the Conqueror's attendant barons on his invasion of England. Here again facts fail lamentably to support the descent claimed, since the earliest known progenitor of this great house was that Henry Russell, who was sent to Parliament to represent Weymouth in the 15th century, and whose great-grandson blossomed into the first Earl of Bedford. It may perhaps be well to state that, although the pedigrees here criticised are those that have been or are widely accepted, they are not necessarily approved by the families whose descent they profess to give.
Another Norman ancestor who must go overboard is the alleged founder of the noble house of Bolingbroke, that William de St. John, who came to England with the Conqueror as Grand Master of the artillery and supervisor of the wagons and carriages, since it can be positively shown that the St. John family first set foot in England a good many years after William I was safely underground. And with this mythical William must also go that equally nebulous progenitor of the Fortescue family, who, according to the venerable and almost uniform tradition, landed in England with his master in the year 1066, and protecting him with his shield from the blows of an assailant, was graciously dubbed Fortescue, the man of the stout shield. The Thorntons, so the peerages say, were of considerable rank before the Conquest, and dictated their own terms to the Conqueror. But, as Canon Jackson, the learned antiquary, truly points out, of this there is no evidence. The name is found, apparently for the first time, among Wiltshire landowners in the reign of Edward I, when a Nicholas Thornton held one knight's fee under the Lovells of Castle Cary. The Duke of Norfolk has a family tree of very stately growth, and can well afford to repudiate a good many of the ancestors provided for him by peerage editors. Certainly, if he ever read the following statement, he must have smiled aloud. The Duke's proudest boast is that his name of Howard is merely that of an ancestor, Hereward the Wake, whose representative, Sir Hereward Wake, is still in Northamptonshire. As a matter of fact, his Grace's earliest known ancestor was Sir William Howard, who was a grown man and on the bench in 1293, whose real pedigree is very obscure, and who, no doubt, would have laughed as heartily as his descendant of today at his imaginary derivation from the Conqueror's stubborn foe of the fens, Hereward the Wake. In the Fitzwilliam pedigree we encounter another nebulous knight of the Conqueror. The Fitzwilliams, we are informed, date so far back that their record is lost, but Sir William, a knight of the Conqueror's day, married the daughter of Sir John Elmley, and so on, and further that at Milton Hall, Peterborough, one may actually look on an antique scarf, which was presented to a direct ancestor of the Fitzwilliams by William the Conqueror. The most skilled of our genealogists have sought in vain for an authentic trace of this gallant knight of Conquest days, and Professor Freeman does not hesitate to dismiss the story of his existence as pure fable. But if Sir William of Normandy must fall from the family tree, his place is most creditably taken by Godric, a Saxon thane, who as a forefather is at least as respectable as any Norman warrior in William's train. The house of Fitzgerald is credited with an ancestor, one Dominus Otho, who is supposed to have been of the family of the Gherardini of Florence. This noble passed over into Normandy, and thence, in 1057, into England, where he became so great a favourite with Edward the Confessor that he excited the jealousy of the Saxon thanes. Dominus Otho must too pass, with many another treasured ancestor, into the crowded genealogical land of the rejected, for the real founder of the Fitzgerald house was Walter, son of Other, whose name is first met with in Domesday Book in 1086. The Otho story is shown to be absolute fiction. In view of such examples of misplaced ingenuity exhibited by the makers of pedigrees for our noble families, one can almost read without a smile that "there were Hennages at Hainton in the time of King Edwy. They doubtless took part in the revolt which brought Edgar to the throne, and it is not impossible that some of them were in the train of Wulfhere, King of Mercia." Or that
Lord Aylington comes of a family of ancient lineage, one of his ancestors being Sir Hildebrand Aylington, who was marshal to William the Conqueror at the Battle of Hastings, though we may know full well that the Stuart pedigree really begins in the 17th century, and that the earliest known Heneage lived and died some 3 centuries before. But noble families have no monopoly of misguided genealogy. The immense majority of the pedigrees of the landed gentry, says a well-known officer of arms, cannot, I fear, be characterized as otherwise than utterly worthless. The errors of the peerage are as nothing to the fables which we encounter everywhere. And the same may be said of many another collection of pedigrees which is a treasured possession in countless British homes. Some even justly famous men have not been proof against this insidious form of vanity and pretence. Edmund Spenser was ungenerous enough to dismiss his known ancestry of small Lancashire gentry and plant himself modestly in the shadow of the newly discovered shield of arms of the noble house of Spencer, of which I meanest boast myself to be, and Lord Tennyson, whose ultimate ascertainable forefather was an 18th century Lincolnshire apothecary, was provided with a slightly differenced cadet's version of the arms of Archbishop Tennyson, with whom he had no connection whatever. End of chapter 25. End of Love Romances of the Aristocracy by Thornton Hall.